Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to begin by picking up the evidence of Mr Bob Ledson, which we had to interrupt last week. So I'm going to ask Mr Ledsome to come back in. Good morning, Mr Ledsome.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming back. I'm sorry we've had to get you back to finish your evidence, but...
Yes, I understand the circumstances.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, Mr Millett.
Mr. Morning. Mr. Chairman, good morning to you. Members of the panel, good morning to you. Mr. Ledsome, good morning.
Good morning.
It may seem a long time ago, but last week when we finished, I was asking you some questions about paragraph 220 of your witness statement. Can we please have that back up at CLG 3019465, page 57? And I'll just remind you, because of the time that's elapsed since you were last sitting there, of what we were on, and you were answering the question here in your statement about the awareness of the department of concerns about the testing of cladding products, including ACM panels and insulation materials, and the reliability of the test results, product information, and what steps were taken. And you say there, I'm only aware of one specific case which was brought to our attention in July 2014 of the potential misclassification of an insulation product leading to the issue of an incorrect certificate by the certification body, and that was the BBA. And in the last two sentences of that paragraph, you say the BBA informed us of the actions which they had taken as set out in the email exchanges. I was informed by Brian Martin of the case at the time and agreed the actions he took. That was about K15, and you told us that you had discussed the BBA's response to that problem with Brian Martin and Richard Harrell, and it was your collective view that, as you said, you had to accept the assurance that you received, and that was at day 242, page 219, line 18. Now, that's where we left off.
Yes.
Now, let's also look at what you were looking at, I think, by way of the BBA certificates. And that is, or those are, at CLG 50687 and 688. Let's have those up. Let's have them on the screen at the same time. CLG 50687 and 688. There they are. And they were sent to you by email, as we know, on the 11th of July by Brian Martin. And you can see the dates at the bottom. On the right-hand side, 27th of October 2008, amended in April 2010, in the very small italics on the right-hand side at the foot of the grey box. And on the left-hand side, 17th of December 2013, second issue. Yes?
Yeah.
You told us that you would imagine you would have looked at them to understand what was being talked about. That was page 207 of day 242, lines 3 to 9. I'm coming to a question. Mr. Harrell told us on day 244 yesterday, at page 89, lines 14 to 15, that he recalls reviewing these certificates with you and Mr. Martin at some stage. Now, my first question is that correct?
I'm not sure, obviously, what Mr. Harrell meant in terms of review. I do not recall an in-depth interrogation of these certificates. It may be that we did go into them in quite a degree of detail. I do not recall that, and certainly I'm not necessarily sure that all of that, I would have understood all of that detail at the time.
Do you remember the upshot of the discussions, a conclusion?
Well, I think the upshot of the discussion was and I don't know the timing of this in relation to the email exchanges which Mr. Martin had with the BBA.
11th of July 2014.
Which would have been, were that the email exchanges with?
Yes, with the NHBC.
Right, so my understanding of the position, or my recollection of the position rather, is that we pursued this in twofold, as you'd have already identified, to follow up with the NHBC about what they were doing, and then secondly, on the back of that information provided by the NHBC, we got in touch with Mr. Martin rather, got in touch with the BBA to understand the BBA's position on this certificate.
How familiar were you as the result of the discussion that you don't recall but might have had with Richard Harrell and Brian Martin with the technical defects in the 27th of October 2008 certificate?
I would not say that I was familiar in particular with the detail of the deficiencies in the certificate.
Now, let's go to the 11th of July, CLG 50686. You can see that the email at the bottom of the screen is from Steve Evans to Brian Martin, copied to Diane Marshall and Neil Smith of the NHBC, 11th of July 2014 at 14:11. And at the top of the screen, if we scroll back to that, please, also the 11th of July at 15:49, Brian Martin essentially forwards this to you and Richard Harrell. You see that?
Yes.
And I'll come back to what he says in that covering email in a moment. First, looking at the email on the second part of the screen, if we can just scroll up, please, or down rather, to see that email in full. Just looking at it, it starts, "Dear Brian, I hope you are well. Neil Smith has discussed your email with me below and asked me to respond as I've been dealing with this on behalf of NHBC. This is an issue that NHBC are aware of and have been in discussions with industry about it for some time." That's the first paragraph. Do you remember whether you read this with care when Brian Martin forwarded it to you?
Well, I obviously read it to understand the issue that was being raised.
Look at page 2, please, the first paragraph on that page, where he says, "There is no reason to suspect that buildings which have been built with Kingspan K15 are at risk at this time. It is just the fact that the testing carried out to date does not bear this out." And then it goes on, "Kingspan are confident that the testing currently underway will prove the suitability of the material for use over 18 metres. If they are not able to do this, we will begin the process of informing industry that the product is no longer suitable for use in facades over 18 metres, as well as informing other stakeholders such as BCA and the Fire and Rescue Service, although both parties are already aware of our ongoing discussions." Now, it's that first sentence I'm interested in, Mr Ledsome, which I read to you. Did you understand from that Kingspan was claiming that K15 was suitable for use over 18 metres in a generic sense, despite the information in the same email that testing to date does not bear this out?
So, given taking the first sentence with the second sentence, I think that's probably an inference I would have drawn from reading that paragraph.
Well, it's certainly, well, let me put it this way, it's an inference you would have drawn. I can see why you say that, but
Yeah.
Was it an inference that you did draw?
I think it probably is, yes.
Yes. And what was done by the department to address that?
Well, the first thing, obviously, was to ask to be kept informed of the further testing, which Kingspan had undertaken to carry out with the NHBC, and then alert the NHBC to the results. And then, secondly, we followed up, or Mr. Martin followed up with the BBA.
Right. Was anything done to contact Kingspan itself?
No.
Why is that?
I think at this stage we placed a reliance in the work that at this stage, I think that we felt confident that the NHBC had got a grip on the issue, and that they would be following up vigorously with Kingspan, and therefore we probably felt that when with hindsight this possibly was something we should have done. We didn't feel the need to contact Kingspan direct.
Did you carry out or cause to have carried out any checks or queries on the product literature that Kingspan was using?
Not of the product literature, no.
Why is that?
Well, I think that we would have expected Kingspan to have been acting responsibly and to have ensured that any product literature that it was producing with regard to this product properly reflected the results of the tests which had been undertaken and which made very clear the limits of application for which would have been associated with that.
Well, you'd seen the BBA certificates, which
Yes.
did not do that, did they?
Well, the BBA certificate may not have done that, but I would have expected Kingspan as a responsible manufacturer to have appreciated that and made sure that its any product literature properly reflected the BBA certificate.
Why did you assume or think that Kingspan would act as a responsible manufacturer in light of, one, the content of the BBA certificate upon which it had been trading since October 2008, as you by this stage knew, and secondly, by reference to the fact that it was claiming the use or suitability of K15 generically, as you inferred, over 18 metres?
Well, I would have liked to have thought that an organisation as big as Kingspan would act responsibly in this matter, and perhaps that, perhaps frankly, that was naive, and I would accept that. Yeah.
Does that naivety explain why you and nobody in your department took any steps to contact Trading Standards or the Advertising Standards Authority?
Well, I think that we would have thought whether Trading Standards or the Advertising, the Advertising Authority would have been the right authorities in this regard. I think our first focus would have been on building control, and personally I would have taken some comfort in what is said in the last sentence of that paragraph, which refers to the fact that the NHBC had already informed the BCA, i.e. private sector approved inspectors more widely, and the LABC and the Fire and Rescue Service about the issue. Now, I fully accept that we did not pursue that directly. We did not make direct contact with those organisations. And again, in hindsight, that is something that I can see that we should have done, even if only to double check that what the NHBC had told the LABC, etc., was in line with our understanding of the issue. And that was an omission.
Did you understand from this email that a BBA certificate, in fact the one we've looked at, asserting that Kingspan's K15 was suitable for use above 18 metres generically, had been in circulation since 2008?
Well, clearly that is what the certificate says.
Did you understand from that NHBC had apparently relied on the terms of that certificate and had been accepting K15 generically for use at height for many years?
I'm not sure how far the significance and significance of that point registered with me. I had been, I would guess, and I'm trying to recall my thought processes at this point in time, or rather what I think my thought processes would have been, that clearly there was an issue which the NHBC had recognised, and it was acting responsibly in response to that, and that they had a grip on the issue. Though I fully recognise, obviously, that there is 5 plus 6 years worth of history there. But I think, I suppose at this point in time, I did not have an appreciation of the number of buildings that could have been covered by this, and that is clearly a question which it was remiss not to ask in terms of to get a more detailed response from either the NHBC or the BBA, or indeed if you had thought to contact Kingspan.
Was the first sentence of this paragraph here not a red flag to you that the NHBC was either going too soft on Kingspan or not understanding the regulatory regime?
No, I don't think it was. I don't think it would have raised a red flag with me. I possibly placed too much on the words of that email in terms of a level of assurance or comfort, which, as I said 2 minutes ago, perhaps was optimistic, indeed possibly naive of me to have done that. So I think reading this is that, yes, there has been a problem with the certificate, but we think that with further testing, and therefore which would ensure that although the original certificate was too wide in its application, that would not be a problem because the testing would bear that out, as per what is said in the second clause of this email, of this paragraph of this email.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the first sentence, which we can read,
Yes.
And one can interpolate. Did it not strike you as absurd when you read it?
No, it did not strike me as absurd.
It didn't strike you as absurd for NHBC to say that there's no reason to suspect that buildings built with K15 are at risk, even though there's no testing which had been done to show that they were not at risk?
Well, there's a cause and effect there. I mean, the testing had not been carried out. Clearly, no. That's a statement of fact, but it was quite possible that the testing would indeed have revealed that the certificate, as issued, would have been suitable for those other wall systems, which at the time were not covered by the specific BS 8414 test
Indeed.
referenced in the certificate. So I don't regard it as absurd. An HBC would be, a responsible building control body, and I would expect them to, on a matter like this, in response to a query from the department, to be very careful and clear and accurate in what they told us.
Would you not think it irresponsible of a building control officer to pass the use of a material above 18 metres on the basis that it hadn't been tested yet for reaction to fire, but would be in the future? That would be an act of the grossest irresponsibility, surely, Mr. Ledsome.
Well, I think the building, in terms of building control officers, they would have had the evidence of the certificate in front of them, and they would have had to have worked from that evidence in terms of individual building control officers. So I don't think this is a question of individual building control officers being irresponsible in this matter. I think that there are legitimate questions as to how far, we and maybe the NHBC also were accepting at this point of what Kingspan were telling them and then us through the NHBC. And as I said, with hindsight, perhaps we should have, in effect, done more inquiries off our own bat rather than relying on third-party communications.
See, the reason I suggest this would be, or should have been, a red flag to you was that the lack of testing carried out to date, which didn't support the absence of risk, was the very reason to suspect that buildings built with Kingspan K15 might be at risk. That's the point. But that didn't strike you at the time.
Well, it didn't strike me in those terms. And
can we go back a page, please, to page 1? And you can see in the second paragraph there of the email, in the last sentence, that there's a reference to the LABC.
Yeah.
We understand the LABC have also issued a registered detail approving the material for use over 18 metres. Did you seek to obtain a copy of the LABC certificate?
I personally did not.
Why is that?
Well, firstly, that would have been something which I would have asked Mr Martin to investigate with the LABC.
Did you? Did you ask him?
I can't recall, so I would not say that I did. The second point is that I would have noted from the material we've just looked at that the NHBC via the BCA would have been in touch with LABC, and therefore I would have presumed, again, didn't check this, and that was an omission, and again, maybe can be accused of being too optimistic or naive about this, would have expected LABC to respond in terms of checking what their registered details said and whether what it said was appropriate to the particular circumstances and the particular test results.
Let's go to the top of the email chain, please. And we can see Brian Martin's email that I showed you briefly earlier this morning, in which he forwards Steve Evans' email to him, to you. And he says this: Richard, Bob, see below, it would appear that a number of tall apartment buildings have been insulated using combustible insulation materials when perhaps they shouldn't have been. This appears to be due to a, quotes, error, unquotes, in a BBA certificate for this type of insulation. NHBC are aware and are working with the manufacturer to see if this is a problem or not. If it is a problem, some blocks may need to have their cladding replaced, brackets, possibly a lot of them, close brackets. I've asked NHBC to keep us informed. Now, in light of what you can see there,
yep.
Brian Martin's warning that there were, quotes, possibly a lot of them, did you take steps to establish whether there were any such blocks, and if so, how many?
No, I did not.
Why not?
At this stage, I think I was thinking we needed to discover more about what was going on or what had gone on, and therefore that at this stage the best course of action was to continue the dialogue with the NHBC and also to contact the BBA.
So, not investigating the presence of K15 across the built environment?
No.
Not investigating with the LABC how many high-rise buildings with K15 had been signed off since 2008?
No.
Not investigating that very fact with the NHBC itself, who of course had, as we've heard, a very large share of the AI, approved inspector market, if one can call it that.
No, I would have expected that information if to have come from the NHBC, but I accept from the email correspondence that I've seen that we didn't ask that explicit question of them.
Right. You can see that there's a contingency written in, or a conditionality written into Brian Martin's email. At what stage and on the basis of what specifically did you satisfy yourself that despite all you had learnt, there were no blocks which would need to have their cladding replaced?
Well, I think that in some later correspondence, as I had understood that the problems or the misapplication of the BBA certificate had been notified to the manufacturer, and that action was being taken in terms of then informing or looking at whether this was a real problem for some buildings.
But the only way it would not be a real problem, isn't this correct? It is that if every single cladding system underwent a system test under BS 8414, parts 1 or 2, and satisfied the BR 135 criteria.
Well, absolutely, yes, I accept that the only way to have got certainty would have been to have done something similar to the action which the department took post Grenfell in terms of the building safety programme, which of course would have is a massive undertaking, and rightly so.
Well, the question I really have is why wasn't that done on your learning from Mr. Martin that there was at least a risk that in the built environment there were possibly a lot of blocks that might need to have their cladding replaced?
Well, I mean, looking at this with hindsight, I would accept that we should have thought about what potential scenarios could have been and what we could have done in response to those, and that I took too much on trust the information that was being fed back to us from the BBA and the NHBC. Now, whether we could have done something similar to the building safety programme at that point in time, with all that would have entailed, I don't know, but at the very least I would accept that we should have given serious and proper consideration to that option, and that was, no doubt you would ask me about escalation, and that we should have escalated that to higher up the office for a consideration.
Higher up the office?
Yes.
How high?
Well, I mean, certainly to my director, and it may well, given if we were suggesting something like a building safety programme, which would involve major expenditure, major resource allocation, potentially even something like the sort of, the short-term testing programme that the department put in place immediately post Grenfell to ascertain whether, what systems, what actually was on in the systems, that probably would have needed to have gone higher up the department and certainly would have required ministerial sign-off.
Now, the answers you've just given me to the last few questions, for which I'm grateful, are hindsight questions.
Yes.
What did you not know on the 11th of July 2014 that you now know?
Well, I didn't know the extent of the problem. I did not know the extent of the problem in terms of the number of buildings which potentially had been, where the certificate had been used erroneously. Frankly, I probably did not know at this point in time the details of how the system worked, i.e. how information was derived from an individual BS 8414 test, how results from those tests could or could not be extrapolated and used in other situations, which no doubt we may want to come on and talk about. And I certainly was clearly unaware of some of the background to the way in which this certificate had been, or the test on which this certificate had been based, the way in which the results of those tests had been expressed in the language used in the certificates, particularly the 2008 certificate.
Can we go briefly, please, to CLG 3014889? This is an email from Brian Martin to you and Richard Harrell on the 15th of June 2017 at 17:03. That's the day after the fire at Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
And Brian Martin sends you the same email chain that we've just been looking at from the 11th of July 2014.
Yes.
And says this is connected with the BBA issue. What was the context of that email? I mean, quite apart from the fire, obviously, but...
Well, I think at this point in time, we all collectively, and I in particular, was trying to pull together strands of information about events which might bear on what had happened at Grenfell, and the wider implications. So I see this as probably a request, which I presume I made verbally to Mr. Martin or Mr. Harrell, and then to Mr. Martin for a reminder of this particular issue, because I'm guessing, I can't recall, but I'm guessing this is something. There's something in my back of my mind. We've come across something. Please remind me. So I see it purely in those terms.
Now, it was Mr. Harrell's evidence at day 244, page 134, line 13, that there was a separate policy team in the division, your division,
yes,
that had oversight of the building control system.
Yes.
He also said you managed that team.
Yes.
Is that correct?
It is correct.
It is correct. What team was it? What was the team?
Okay, so it was a small team, and the responsibility of that team was, yes, oversight of the building control system, but in terms of the policy and regulatory framework. I mean, as you'll be aware, there are a lot of procedural requirements in the building regulations and the approved inspectors regulations, and indeed there are the charging regulations as well. So that team's responsibility was to look after those aspects of the building regulations, i.e. the procedural elements of the regulations, and also the competent persons schemes arrangements.
And who was on that team?
Gosh, so there were 2 grade 7s, Anthea Nicholson, I think you've come across emails from her before. She dealt with the competent persons scheme. Ian Drummond, who dealt with the building regulations, procedural arrangements and approved inspectors. They were supported by, from memory, 1 SEO and 1 HEO, probably on a sort of flexible basis working across the 2, and there may have been some administrative support as well.
At this time, going back to July 2014 and on your receipt of the email, did you notify the policy team that there may be problems with building control as a matter of policy? Building control accepting the use of K15 at height generically without a supporting test?
No, not at this time. Can I just provide a little bit of context in terms of our relationship with building control bodies, the department's relationship with building control bodies. I mean, it will not have escaped your attention that the Building Act provides very few powers, if any, other than a default power for the Secretary of State to take action in respect of local authorities. The Building Act clearly places the responsibility for enforcing the Building Act and the building regulations onto local authorities. There are no powers in the Secretary of State in the Building Act as it's currently for example, the Secretary of State to direct local government on this matter. There are no powers even for the Secretary of State to demand information from local authorities on this matter. The only power for the Secretary of State is in effect, default power to take over a failing, it's not even take over a failing building control department. It would be to intervene in a very specific case where the relevant building control body was in dereliction of its duties in relation to that case. So our legal powers to do anything were very limited. We were working at this point under the coalition government under a general policy, which I'm simplifying and maybe caricaturing, which is that central government should get out of local government's hair and let local government get on with it, the localism policy. So there was very limited ability for us to certainly sort of intervene with building control bodies if there were problems with the way in which building control bodies were conducting their business. Obviously, this was a big issue. We did look at whether we could do things in the discussion document process as part of our looking at the building control system, but we were limited there because any significant changes would require changes to the primary legislation, which were not available, an option not available to us. So I appreciate that's been a bit of a digression, but I did not inform Mr Drummond, whose side it would have been on, because I'm not at all sure that Mr Drummond could have done anything. All we could have done, and I accept that we did not do that, and that was an omission, would have been to inform building control bodies of the problem with this particular certificate, and make sure that their building control officers were aware of said problems. I think that would have been a legitimate thing for us to do, to make use of, for example, a circular letter we've discussed previously. We did not do that. I regret that. I think, again, probably I personally, maybe we collectively placed too much comfort or assurance on the fact that, as per the email exchanges, the NHBC had been in touch with, for example, LABC by the BCA, and therefore the LABC was responding. But I absolutely accept, if you ask me, well, why didn't someone phone up the LABC? Yes, it would have been a simple, straightforward thing to have done. We didn't do that. I can't find a reason for that, and I regret that that was an omission, and I was party to that omission.
I mean, is there, just in that last part of that answer, is it the case that the department really relied on bodies like the NHBC or the LABC or the BCA to do its work in making sure that building control officers were alive to a particular problem?
Well, I don't know who you mean by "it's" in that context, because, as I said, the department's position was quite limited, but I accept the point that we did rely heavily on the LABC, the NHBC, the BCA, other approved inspectors, SICARE, for example, to be doing a good, robust job in ensuring that collectively and building control was on top of issues like this, because this isn't an issue which is private sector or public sector specific, that they were on top of this issue, that appropriate guidance was being issued, that they were ensuring that the constituent bodies, i.e. individual local authority building control departments or individual approved inspectors, were properly ensuring that their individual building control officers were aware and able to and responding appropriately. We discussed the devolved system. I think when I gave evidence last week, we were operating in that devolved system. Personally, we felt our hands were pretty tied in how we could deal with building control bodies. Could we have pushed the boundaries further? I think the answer to that must be yes. Why didn't we push the boundaries further? I think it was just the mindset, frankly, that we were in, which was not as challenging perhaps as it could and indeed should have been on some occasions.
Would it be fair to describe it as complacency?
No, I would not refer to it as complacency. What I would say is that we placed a reliance on a system operating in the way the system was meant to operate, as set out and enshrined in the parent legislation. And clearly, you only have to read the first page of Dame Judith Hackett's report to realise that assumption was badly misplaced. And I regret that it took that report to really uncover that and provide the impetus for the very important reforms which are currently going through the House.
Can we then go back to the minutes of the CWCT Fire Group meeting of the 2nd of July 2014? Those are at CLG 3019336. And I'd like to go to page 3 with you, please. And there's a heading there, Combustibility of Insulation. You see that?
Yes.
And it says this: limited combustibility insulation should be used above 18 metres when following the prescriptive requirements of ADB clause 12.7, but other materials, principally foil-faced phenolic foam, are often used in rain screen walls. There is a degree of ignorance, with some people confusing class 0 with limited combustibility. In other cases, building control officers are permitting the use of class 0 materials, making it difficult for cladding consultants to enforce the requirement for limited combustibility insulation. Higher standards of thermal insulation are requiring greater thicknesses of insulation, and in some cases this can only be achieved within the designated wall zone by use of combustible insulation. Architects are unaware of the problem and need to allow a wider wall zone to accommodate the greater thickness required with limited combustibility material. Now, that discussion there is not about the misclassification of a particular product as a one-off error by the BBA, is it?
No.
No. It's about an industry-wide confusion between class 0 on the one hand and limited combustibility on the other, isn't it?
Well, it's a discussion, yeah, yes.
Yes. Were you aware of that confusion or any discussions about it before the 2nd of July 2014?
Well, I was not aware of that confusion. Is the 2nd of July, is this the date of this meeting?
Yes.
Yes. No, I was not aware of that, and I didn't see these minutes. I hadn't seen these minutes at the time either.
Now, Brian Martin was at the meeting, or at least part of the meeting, and he says he received a copy of the minute.
Right.
Where would that minute be filed?
Well, I would have expected Mr Martin to have filed it on the relevant files relating to his area of work, Part B.
Right. Would you have had access to File B?
In theory, yes. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. There was a divisional filing system, so on the basis that information was filed correctly, then yes, I would have had access to it, as anybody else in the division would have had access to it.
Right. And would you routinely, as part of the way you worked, have looked at the minute?
No, I wouldn't. I would have only looked at it if it had been specifically drawn to my attention.
So can we take it that Brian Martin did not draw the minute to your attention?
Not that I can recall, no.
At any stage, ever?
Well, not until after the Grenfell fire.
Right. So I take it from that answer, not during the discussions during July in the context of Brian Martin's own discussions with NHBC about K15?
Not that I recall.
Right. Do you accept, looking at the minute now, that if you had seen it or had been told about the discussions on the page there, that it might have become apparent to you that there was a wider problem?
Well, I would have liked to have thought that, yes, I would have wanted to understand exactly what this was about and what exactly the issues were with regard to the statement about the confusion of Class 0 with limited combustibility. And I would have liked to have thought that I would have asked for or looked in more detail at what ADB Clause 12.7 says and sought to understand what the intention of that clause in the context of the rest of ADB
Yes.
Section 12 was, and whether it was delivering that intention or not.
Right. Given the way you and Brian Martin worked at the time, would you have expected him to have told you, at least in outline, about what this paragraph, or these two paragraphs are saying? Certainly the first, that there's a degree of ignorance in the industry.
Well, I would have thought if Mr Martin felt that this was a real problem, that either directly or through Mr Harrell, he would have told me.
Right. I see. Now, in paragraph 220 of your statement, you say that this was followed up by Brian Martin. Do you know what the final outcome was?
The final outcome was, I think there was some exchanges with the BBA, which I think provided, from recollection, provided me with some comfort that the BBA also were on top of this issue, that it was a one-off issue. It had been dealt with, and that they had been taking appropriate action to inform those who needed to be informed.
Did you form that conclusion as a result only of your own study of what the BBA, John Alban, was saying about what had been done, it being attributable to human error, or did you form that conclusion as a result of what Brian Martin told you?
Well, I think I was copied in. I certainly saw, at about the time or shortly thereafter, the emails or the email exchanges that Mr Martin had with Mr Alban without knowing exactly what that email said. I don't know whether I could have drawn that conclusion from what Mr Alban had said or from talking with Mr Martin. I think it probably would have been a combination of the two, realistically.
Now, were you aware that Steve Evans, NHBC, had updated Brian Martin on the 15th of August 2014, and I summarised, to tell him that Kingspan had carried out 2 further tests and that the full results of those tests would be available within the next 2 months?
I think I was probably aware of follow-up. I don't know, you can help me as to whether I was copied in on any email correspondence at that time, which would have enabled me to read what progress had happened.
I think not, but let's just check with you. CLG 3019253, please, which is the 15th of August 2014 emails. You can see that there is an email from Steve Evans to Brian Martin of that date. It's not copied to you.
No.
But were you aware of the email or the content of it? Further meeting with Kingspan, 2 further tests carried out at BRE. Promise to engage Arup.
I cannot recall. I cannot recall being shown or told about this email. Now that I'm looking at it, I would have been surprised if Mr. Martin hadn't mentioned this, that he'd had further follow-up with the NHBC and in broad terms what was happening.
Right. Looking at the third paragraph there, you can see that Steve Evans sends Brian Martin a copy of the BCA guidance note. That's Technical Guidance Note 18 on the use of combustible cladding materials.
Yes.
Do you remember seeing that Technical Guidance Note 18 at the time?
I can't recall that.
Right. Let's then move on to December of that year, CLG 1306889. These are minutes from a BCA Technical Liaison Group meeting of the 8th of December 2014. And you can see that Steve Evans was in the chair. Have you seen these minutes before?
I don't believe I have.
Right, so you didn't see them at the time?
I certainly didn't see them at the time.
We know that they were sent to Richard Harrell on the 15th of April 2015 with the agenda for the next meeting of that group. Let me just show you that. CLG 100068884. And it's the top email on the screen, Steve Evans to all the members. And you can see Richard Harrell is in there as the penultimate recipient.
Yes.
Papers for tomorrow's meeting. And you can see that that's going to happen on the 16th.
Yes.
And the papers are sent. One of the papers was the minutes of the previous meeting, the 8th of December 2014. So it looks as if those minutes would have come into the department. My question for you is, would those minutes have been circulated or filed in some way within the department?
I would have anticipated that they would have been filed. I don't think that they would have necessarily been circulated.
Let's go to CLG 100068889 then, and the minutes themselves that we looked at a moment ago. There is the date, 8th December 2014, and the attendees, and then action required column and comments and progress. You see that?
Yes.
And if we go, please, to page 4, item 12.0, you can see there it says use of combustible materials in cladding systems to buildings over 18 metres. SE, that's Steve Evans, NHBC, outlined the work carried out to date in identifying possible solutions to allowing polyurethane-type insulation materials to be used in cladding systems over 18 metres. SEBT to discuss further, outside of the meeting, confirmation of any actions to be fed back to the group. And BT is Barry Turner of LABC. And SE is Steve Evans. Would you agree that those notes would tend to indicate, in clear terms, that the BCA were working with Steve Evans of NHBC not to limit, but to permit, to allow the use of polyurethane-type insulation materials to be used over 18 metres?
I would certainly accept that that is an inference to be drawn from that second sentence. But the only comment I would make is that I think, as was mentioned in one of the earlier exchanges, the energy efficiency requirements that were coming through in Part L, and an update to Part L had recently had come into force, were the polyurethane type insulation was a type of insulation which might be needed to be used to ensure that the Part L requirements are met. So yes, allowing, it absolutely says allowing rather than limiting, and it doesn't say properly controlled, which perhaps it should have done. But I think that might have been, I'm speculating, that might have been why this discussion was held. But I absolutely accept that there's no reference in that, indeed in the whole of the write-up of that agenda item, to the need to ensure that where it was used, it was properly controlled, e.g. via BR135 criteria and BS 8414 tests.
My question is we can read the document,
Yes.
Mr. Ledsome. My question is, were you wholly unaware that NHBC and LABC, together on the BCA, were looking for solutions to permit the use of polyurethane type insulation above 18 metres? This is a general activity.
I absolutely accept. And if you just forgive me, I will just slightly hesitate because I have been trying to rack my brains as to when I first became aware of BCA Guidance Note 18. I was not aware of it at this point in time. So I clearly, at this point in time, that these discussions were happening in the BCA and these conclusions were being drawn by the BCA, I was not aware of them. And I'm pretty sure that I didn't see or hadn't, if I had seen it, hadn't registered with me the draft of the BCA Guidance Note 18 version 0. So my question to myself, and I've really thought long and hard about this, is was I aware of this at any subsequent point in time before the Grenfell fire? And I think the only honest conclusion I can reach is that I was not.
Now, can we then go to CLG 3019267? This takes us into the spring of 2015. It's an email from Steve Evans of NHBC to Brian Martin, 2nd of April 2015, as you can see, copy to others within the NHBC. Subject, update on combustible materials in the envelope of buildings over 18 metres. And there's an attachment, guidance to builders. And he says, hello, Brian, I hope that you are well. I'm conscious that we have not provided an update on our progress with the manufacturers of combustible insulation materials that are marketed as being suitable for use in buildings over 18 metres for some time, and I must apologise for this, but this has been an extremely complicated process in ensuring that the information we provide to our builders is correct and allows them as much flexibility to demonstrate compliance as is possible. Did you see this at the time?
I don't recall seeing it at the time.
Were you made aware of the fact at the time that NHBC were not only still working on this matter as of April 2015, but apparently finding it, as he puts it, an extremely complicated process?
Not that I can recall.
So Brian Martin didn't tell you that?
Not that I can recall.
Did Brian Martin tell you at all that the NHBC were allowing builders as much flexibility to demonstrate compliance as is possible?
I don't recall that he told me that.
Let's look at his response to this email. That's at NHB 401057. And if we look at the top of the email chain, NHB 401057, yes, thank you, we can see that Brian Martin writes back to Steve Evans on the 7th of April and responds. And he says this: thanks for this, Steve. If there are common solutions that people are using for the, quotes, engineered, unquotes, approach, I'd be interested to hear about them. It might be that we could adopt them in future editions of AD. There does seem to have been some confusion in the market whether some polymer insulation materials are combustible or not. I guess I shouldn't be that surprised, exclamation mark. Anything you can do to raise awareness has got to be a good thing. Is NHBC content that the existing projects you have dealt with meet these principles? I understood that there had been some questions raised. Brian. Now, can we take it, Mr. Ledsome, that you didn't see that response either?
I don't believe I did, no.
Would you agree that it appears clear that by, or at least in April 2015, Brian Martin did not consider, and looking at that, to be an issue limited to a one-off misclassification of a product in a BBA certificate?
I accept that.
And presumably you were unaware of that at the time?
I was, yes, I cannot recall being aware of it at the time.
And unaware of the fact that Mr. Martin considered that it was a good thing for NHBC to be doing something to raise awareness?
Well, I think it was a good thing for the NHBC to be raising awareness.
Yes, but raising awareness is one thing. Enforcing the building regulations as a regulator through its AI department was another, wasn't it?
Of course, yes.
Now let's look at NHB 402792. This takes us later into 2015. If we go to page 3, please, we see another email from Steve Evans to Brian Martin, this time 15th of June 2015, subject combustible cladding. Good afternoon, Brian. I write to request the department's view regarding the need for limited combustibility external cladding finishes on buildings with the floor level exceeding 18 metres in height, assessed in accordance with paragraph 12.7 of approved document B, together with the associated paragraphs 12.5 to 12.9. And then underneath that, and it goes on at length, Steve Evans went on to set out his own, and indeed the NHBC's, understanding of the sections of the guidance he's asking about. Now, if we go to page 4, please, and let's look together at the final paragraph, he says this. Our own view is that there is little point in ensuring that an insulation product meets with MOLC, MOLC, requirements, materials of limited combustibility, requirements when it can then be faced with a cladding finish which, whilst achieving a Class 0 surface spread of flame requirement, becomes a contributory factor in the spread of fire up the building when acted upon by a flame plume from a flashed-over fire. However, there appears to be a difference in interpretation across the industry, and so your opinion, steer, would be very welcome. Thank you for your time. Did you see this email at the time?
No.
Did you see any of this correspondence at the time?
Not this correspondence, no.
Were you made aware in June 2015 by Brian Martin or anybody else in the department that there was, as he's put here, a difference in interpretation across the industry on the meaning and scope of 12.7 of approved document B?
Not that I can recall.
Did Brian Martin tell you that the NHBC were, in June 2015, asking the department's opinion on that matter?
Not that I can recall.
Let's look at Brian Martin's response, please, at page 2, at the foot of page 2, the next day, 16th of June. And he says this: Hi, Steve, I can't offer a formal view as such. Specific projects are a matter for the relevant building control body. And then over the page, as you say, the overarching objective is that the external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread, and this is particularly important for a block of flats. People do sometimes try to play games with the definitions, and where this happens, one should refer back to this objective. We came across one incident where an EPS foam was used to fill a void behind some aluminium sheeting. Because it was not included specifically for its thermal properties, the designers had concluded that it wasn't insulation, and thus its use was okay. When it caught fire, the flames could be seen across the city! ! That's why the reference to fillers, etc. was included in the AD text. Do you have some examples of specific constructions you've come across? It may be we could revise the text again, or maybe test some of it. Now, can we take it that you were unaware of that response?
Yes.
Can you just help us? Was there anything stopping Brian Martin offering a formal view as such?
Well, I think Mr. Martin, in the first sentence there, or the first paragraph there, is referring to the limitations on what the department could say or comment on in relation to a specific project, given that we were not the enforcement body. So I think that's how I would have read his first sentence. But as he then goes on in the rest of the email, he makes a general comment on the issue. And that's a dialogue that we would have with, for example, the likes of the NHBC or the LABC on general issues about the understanding of the regulations and the approved documents guidance.
But let's go back to the foot of page 1. Brian Martin was not being asked about a specific project, was he?
No, he wasn't, but I think he was making that general point as a sort of context for the rest of what he said in the email.
Well, the second sentence says that, but the first sentence says, I can't offer a formal view as such. Was there anything stopping Brian Martin from offering a formal or even informal but unequivocal view about what the department's position was in answer to the specific generic question Steve Evans had raised?
Well, I think I think what Mr Martin is saying is he is conscious, as I said, that the ability of the department to comment on specific compliance scenarios is related to specific projects was limited. Now, the fact is that I think that in effect he offered that general view in what he said in the following paragraphs of the email. So he provided Mr Evans with a response on the substance of the general issue that Mr Evans asked him about. That's insofar as I've been able to sort of ascertain from a quick glance at the correspondence. So I think it's perfectly reasonable for Mr Martin to have said what he said in that first paragraph. I think it would have been questionable if he then said, that's it, can't say anything, Steve. I think that would have been questionable, but he didn't do that. He sought to comment on the general issue raised by Mr Evans, so I don't see the problem with that.
Well, we've seen the answer he's given, and I'm not going to debate its quality with you. That wouldn't be appropriate. My question for you is, was there a reason, as far as you are aware, why Brian Martin, as the fire safety policy lead, as he was at this time, could not offer an explanation of the meaning of, or as he understood it, or as the department understood it, of particular sections of the approved document on behalf of the department?
Would you mind scrolling on to the next page so I can reread what Mr Martin said, please?
Yes, can we go to page 3, please? Let's do that.
Well, I think the important points I would take from this, and this is with the benefit of hindsight, and obviously a subsequent study of section 12, is the first sentence of the paragraph at the top of the email, which talks about the overarching objective, and that whatever else follows in the guidance, it's important to relate that into the context of that overall objective, which I think is set out in 12.5. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that in the final sentence of the second paragraph, there's a clear explanation, to my mind, that explains what, for example, was meant to be covered by the reference in 12.7 to fillers, etc. So he's talked about an instance where clearly, for whatever reason, a combustible product was used when it shouldn't have been used. So I think that is Mr Evans is obviously was a very experienced building control inspector, I'm presuming, not knowing his background. So necessarily, and Mr Martin obviously had a lot of contact with Mr Evans, and I expect would have regarded himself as having a very good professional relationship with Mr Evans. So I would think that they're probably...
Well, let's not speculate.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, I'm to my mind.
Tell us something you know.
Okay. Well, to my mind, this email does express a view that the reference to fillers, etc., is meant to cover the situations which Mr Evans had talked about, and this, and he makes the offer at the end that if there were things that needed to be done to change AD 12.7, then that's something that could be looked at as part of the next revision of ADB.
Now, I'll just show you the response that Steve Evans reacts with internally with John Lewis at page 2, please, middle of the page, where he says, John, not a very clear answer, indeed not an answer at all. Now, that's how it was received.
Right.
On paper, we have Mr Evans's and Mr Lewis's evidence about that. I don't need to go through that with you. My question, again, was there a reason, as far as you're aware, why Brian Martin could not offer an explanation, could not offer a view, an opinion, a steer?
On a general question, he could have provided an answer to a general question, and that was the question which was posed by the NHBC, without studying the correspondence in detail. I'm not sure whether I'm able to say that Steve Evans' comment to Mr Lewis was a reasonable comment on the basis of Mr Martin's reply to the original email.
Let me try it one more time this way. If the question had been, Brian, I'm looking at 12.7, does it ban combustible cores from rain screen cladding?
Yeah.
There would have been, am I right in thinking there would have been nothing to stop Brian Martin coming back and saying it does?
No, you're correct.
Thank you. Right. Let's move on to the UAE fires, and I want to start with the torch fire in Dubai in 2015. Can we go, please, to CLG 3031073? If we go, please, to the bottom email in the chain, it's an email from Peter Holland on the 21st of February 2015, to various people, including Brian Martin and Louise Upton, subject Dubai high-rise fire. You're not copied into this.
No.
But I think you are copied into the response above it.
Yes.
As you can see, or you can't see, but you are.
Yes.
And I think you accept that because you're
Yes.
familiar with it. Peter Holland says this. The fire last night in the badly named high-rise Torch building appears to have spread rapidly up the outside of the building due to inadequate or non-existent fire resistance in the external elements of the structure. They have had previous fires in Dubai where this has been a similar problem. Thankfully, it appears that the internal fire precautions have worked well enough to enable the circa 2,000 occupants to escape safely. Brian Martin will be able to confirm that this shouldn't be a problem in this country. Peter. And if we go to the next email up in the chain, we can see that Brian Martin responds a little bit later that morning. It's 21st of February 2015, and he says this. As Peter says, they have had a few similar incidents in Dubai. There are provisions in the building regulations designed to prevent this kind of problem, so this shouldn't be a problem in the UK. There are, of course, no guarantees. Now, to what provisions specifically did you understand this to be a reference?
Well, I would imagine he was been referring to B4.
Right, and any specific part of B4?
Well, this would have been a B4 and then the relevant provisions in the approved documents guidance.
Did you check with him what he meant?
No, I don't recall checking with him.
Right. How specifically did those provisions prevent this kind of problem as far as you understood it at the time?
As far as I understood it at the time, I can't. I was been aware of the general requirements, the functional requirement in B4, but I would not have been aware of the specific detail in the guidance in section 12 of approved document B.
What did you make of his final words there? There are, of course, no guarantees.
Well, I mean, I can't comment on why he said that. I can only assume, and this is an assumption, that one would expect and hope, indeed hope, that there would be 100% compliance with the relevant requirements, so it shouldn't be a problem. But as we know, as we found out, regrettably that was misplaced. So I'm not sure that there would have been anything other to it than that general comment, but obviously I can't say what was in his mind when he made that comment.
Did you discuss the no guarantees or indeed any other aspect of the torch fire with Brian Martin?
I can't recall.
Did you understand at the time that this fire involved ACM with a PE product? A PE core?
I wouldn't pretend that I would have understood the detail of the external wall construction. I'm not sure whether, as part of general conversations or anything that I might have seen in some reports of the fire in the media, etc., whether ACM panels would have been involved. So I think I can't say for sure.
Did you discuss this fire or any other international cladding fire that had happened previously? We know some happened in 2012. With any more senior officials in the department or ministers?
Well, we certainly didn't discuss it with ministers, though I note that there seems to be a reference in the email to the office of Penny Mordaunt, the fire safety minister. I also note a number of other senior officials are on the copy list for Mr Martin's email response and the original email from Mr Holland, but I didn't discuss it with any of our, with for example, Minister Williams.
Right, just pause there. Can you just, and we can see in the response, and indeed in the original Peter Holland message, who was, I think by this time the CFRA, wasn't he?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, he sends it to Penny Mordaunt, but also Neil O'Connor and Claire Cooper.
Yes.
Who are they?
So Claire Cooper was my opposite number on the fire safety, in the fire safety division. Neil O'Connor was her director, and at this point in time, I believe, yes, I'm sure this is the case, the Fire Safety Directorate was still part of what was then the Department of Communities Local Government.
Who on the email chain, including the copy parties, were in the Minister's office?
So that would have been the office of Penny Mordaunt. She was the Fire Safety Minister, as I understand at the time, so it would have gone to her private office.
I see. So just Penny Mordaunt. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now let's go. Thank you. Now that's helpful. Let's go to the witness statement of Richard Harrell, please. CLG 30194887, paragraph 64 on page 19. And if we look at the last three lines of that paragraph, he says, I spoke to Brian after the fire, and I remember that there was a process of sense-checking what we knew of the events in Dubai against our own regime and knowledge and evidence base. What was the process of sense-checking against our own regime to which Mr Harrell refers there?
Well, I would have expected, though I don't recall having any conversations about these discussions, but I would have expected that what would have happened is that Mr Harrell would have spoken to Mr Martin to understand what had been caused the fire to spread in the way it did in terms of materials on the particular buildings involved, to have checked the relevant requirements, firstly in the building regulations part B4, to have checked that what was said in the relevant section of approved document 12 provided robust guidance on compliance with those requirements. So that's what I would expect that process to have involved.
Did it happen?
It was not reported to me, so I have to take assurance from Mr Harrell's witness statement, and I believe he said this in his evidence to you yesterday, that those discussions did happen.
I see. Finally, on this topic, before we break, when you saw the emails in June 2015, or when there was discussion in June 2015 in response to the NHBC's question, which we saw earlier, do you remember either you or Brian Martin having any thoughts about that question and how that might relate to this question, namely, looking at the torch fire, could it happen here?
I don't recall that, and I don't recall any discussion. Well, obviously, I've explained that I don't think I was aware of the exchanges in June 2015, certainly at the time, but I certainly don't recall any discussion that potentially joined the dots between what has happened in Dubai, and indeed, there was a later fire, and what was said in approved document 12.7 and some of the issues which you've raised, which you've drawn on in relation to uncertainty about what paragraph 12.7 meant.
To be clear, to the best of your recollection, is it the case that Brian Martin didn't come to you in or after June 2015 and say, well, I've now discovered that there's a difference of interpretation of 12.7 across the industry about whether or not a composite panel with a polyethylene core or a combustible core is permissible. Looking back on the torch fire discussions and Peter Holland's question back in February, there is or maybe a problem.
I don't recall that being raised with me.
It should have been raised with you, though, shouldn't it?
I think it certainly was an important issue, and yes, it probably should have been raised.
Thank you. Is that a convenient moment, Mr. Chair?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Well, Mr. Ledsome, we'll have a short break at this point. We'll come back, please, at 11:30.
Of course.
And just to remind you, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 11:30, please. Would you ask Mr Ledsome to come back in, please?
Third question.
Right, Mr Ledsome, ready to carry on?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Yes, Mr Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ledsome, January 2016, you may recall there was another major fire at a 63-storey hotel in Dubai
Yes.
called the Address Downtown. Can we go to HOM 3043106, please? This is an email run from that month, to January 2016, and if we go to the very foot of the page, we should have it expanded, I think. Thank you. You write to Brian Martin, copied to Richard Harrell, 4th of January 2016, subject Dubai hotel fire. Brian, anything we need to be aware of, / worry about for Part B? And can we take it that that was an immediate, or reasonably immediate reaction to seeing the fire
Yes.
on television?
Yes.
Now, we can see the reply that you received from Brian Martin the same day, about 20 minutes later. And he says, might get some questions raised, nothing new here. The fire is most likely to be similar to several others that have hit Dubai over the last couple of years. It relates to a cladding product which is a laminate of aluminium and polyethylene, or similar. This stuff is very rigid and makes nice, shiny buildings. Sadly, when it gets exposed to a fire, the aluminium melts away and exposes the polyethylene core. Whoosh. Requirement B41 is designed to prevent this kind of thing. Para 12.7 says, in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. The polyethylene core of the offending product would be considered as a filler material, so should not be used over 18 metres. Brian. Now, did you ask him, and we can see, I think, no response from you, but did you ask him at the time what he meant by would be considered as a filler material?
I don't recall asking him that question.
In January 2016, were you already aware of this precise content of paragraph 12.7 of approved document B?
Probably not.
Was this the first time, do you think, that it had been explained to you that Brian Martin believed that that particular provision was the one which would, quotes, prevent this kind of thing happening in this country?
I think it probably was.
Did you go to the text of the approved document to see it in its context and ensure you understood it?
I'm not sure that I did.
Did you check to see that Brian Martin's confidence in it was well-founded?
I'm not sure that I did.
Did you know at the time, did you notice at the time that the heading of the provision was insulation materials / products?
No, I don't think that I did.
Right, so you just took, is this right, that you just took what Mr Martin was telling you on trust and made no further investigations of it?
Well, I would have taken it on trust because I would have expected Mr Martin to have explained, as the expert and cognizant of the detail, to explain to me the relevant provisions in the detail that he felt was helpful and relevant and necessary.
Were you aware at this time of the debate and the confusion in the industry about the meaning of and scope of this paragraph of the approved document, and specifically in relation to whether or not the term filler material actually captured the core of an ACM panel?
No, I don't think I was.
And you think of any possible reason, given that your email was specifically directed to the question whether there was anything there for the division to worry about, your words, in Part B, why Brian Martin didn't tell you at that stage about the confusion that had existed in the industry?
Well, I suppose in respect of the specific question, he was focused on that, but clearly he did not provide any context in that email, and I don't recall him providing me with any other context in any other exchanges.
No. I'm just trying to think of whether you can help us about why that is. I asked you, can you think of any possible reason? Is there one that you can think of?
Well, I mean, reading this exchange, I would have inferred that Mr Martin was very confident in his view about the interpretation of those relevant provisions.
Did you have any understanding in January 2016 about whether or not an ACM panel with a polyethylene core had been installed on any high-rise buildings in the United Kingdom?
I was not aware of that.
As far as you were aware, did Brian Martin himself have any such knowledge?
Well, certainly none that he expressed to me at the time.
Did you ask him?
No, I didn't. I'm not sure. Well, I can't recall, but I think I probably didn't.
Do you know why you didn't ask him, or do we have any ACM PE cord clad buildings over 18 metres in this country?
Well, I think it would have been because I would have taken what was said in this email as pretty clear that we had an appropriate regulation, i.e. B41, in place, and that we had appropriate guidance, i.e. paragraph 12.7 in place to prevent those sorts of products being used in England in buildings over 18 metres.
Did you consider asking Brian Martin at this point to seek informal feedback, perhaps through his network of industry contacts, horizon scanning, I think, as you referred to it, about whether, in fact, ACM products with a PE core might be in use in the United Kingdom?
Well, I did not. Now, whether Mr Martin would have discussed this with Mr Harrell separately, I don't know, but I did not ask that question.
You didn't? Why is that?
Well, as I said, I think I took assurance or comfort from what I took to be a very clear statement about the way the regulations and the guidance operated, and therefore should have been implemented.
So you thought, was this your thought process at the time, that the quotation there from 12.7 was crystal clear and unequivocally and unambiguously applied to the core of a composite rain screen panel?
Well, I was certain I had no reason to doubt that.
Right. Were you also wholly satisfied that there was no risk, or no material risk, that such products were in use here, on the basis of what Brian Martin had told you here?
Well, I think I must have drawn that conclusion.
From what words in the email did you draw that conclusion, do you think?
Well, the statement that the regulation requirement B41 is designed to prevent this kind of thing, so it's clearly addressed in requirement B41. And then secondly, the explanation in the final sentence of the email of the intent of paragraph 12.7.
Yes, would be considered as a filler material. Did his use of the words would be considered signal to you that not only that is what the words mean so far as he's concerned, but that it was universally and unexceptionally understood that way?
Well, I would have thought that if there were any doubts or doubt about that, then that would have been expressed in that in this email. So I took that as read as that would be a general understanding of across the industry and those and duty holders and building control.
Now let's go to February of this year, the next month. I'm going to show you some correspondence between Brian Martin and Nick Jenkins of Booth Murray, who were cladding consultants. Yeah. Can we go please to CLG 3031093 and start with page 5 at the top of the page. This is an email from Nick Jenkins to Brian Martin, copied to others at BRE, of the 16th of February 2016. And he says this: "Hi Brian, I'm forwarding this query to you as recommended by Sarah Colwell of the BRE. As you will note from the correspondence below, Sarah advises the DCLG of the body with responsibility for ADB2. This matter is currently the topic of much discussion in the construction industry, and if one thing is evident, that there is much confusion and misunderstanding. Your soonest review of the matter would therefore be most welcome." Now, the substantive email, which Mr. Jenkins refers to here, and which sets out his concerns, is set out much further down the chain at page 10. And I should show you that, please. It's sent to Sarah Colwell, as you can see, on the 20th of January 2016. from Nick Jenkins. Hi, Sarah. I hope this finds you well. I'm just going to show you quite a lot of this, okay, Mr. Ledsome, if I may. He says, we haven't met. However, I understand that you might be the best person to help me with some clarification I'm seeking in relation to my understanding of the current UK regulations as they apply to wall constructions for building over 18 metres, featuring rain screen panels formed from ACMs. Last week I attended a Siderise/BRE Facades conference on the topic of fire safety. During the day, I asked some questions of the panel relating to the permissible use of rain screen cladding panels formed from various grades of ACM, aluminium composite materials, when used as part of multi-layered wall systems for building over 18 metres. There was some ambiguity in the answers provided by the panel. I believe, and he goes on in that email to explain his understanding of the source of the ambiguity. But let's, to speed things up, let's go to the final paragraph of the email at the very foot of page 10. And he says, page 10. The foot of page 10, thank you. In my understanding, compliance is not achieved via an if either one or two are satisfied scenario. And just to pause there, one is meeting the guidance of 12.6 to 12.9 by restricting insulation product, filler material, etc., to materials of limited combustibility. And then two is diagram 40, which is class 0. Those are the two prongs. And he says, in my understanding, compliance is not achieved via an if either one or two are satisfied scenario, rather only via an if one and two are both satisfied scenario. I think this is especially following the recent evidence of fire spread up the facade of a number of buildings in the Middle East with, turn the page, combustible cladding panels. A simple read through the approved document, however, would not tell you this. And then if we go to page 11 where we are now, he says this, if my understanding is correct and the scope of 12.7 extends to also include the external cladding and the 3mm thick core associated with 4mm ACM is to be considered a filler material, then, as far as I'm aware, the only ACMs available to the UK market that meet the ADB2 definition of being materials of limited combustibility are Alpolic A2 and Alucobond A2. Both of these products are classified as A2S1D0 in accordance with BSEN 13501 of 2007. In our experience of supplying fabricated ACM rain screen panels to specialist cladding contractors in the UK market, we are rarely asked to provide such A2-rated ACM materials. The vast majority of ACM panels we are asked to provide for architectural application are either Alucobond Plus, Alpolic FR, or Larsen FR products, all of which are classified as B. S1D0 in accordance with BSEN 13501 2007, and thus, whilst they can be classified as products that are hard to burn and are not accepted as being of limited combustibility in accordance with Table A7, Appendix A of ADB2. In many instances, it is not even the BS1D0 rated ACM panels we are asked to supply, but standard polyethylene core material ACM that burns quite efficiently. What's more, I'm aware of many tall residential buildings recently constructed in the UK where such panels are installed in combination with various foil-faced rigid foam thermal insulation boards which are also not accepted as being of limited combustibility in accordance with Table A7 Appendix A of ADB2. As a responsible supplier, Booth Muri Euroclad would like to put a guidance note out to the market written specifically on routes to compliance in relation to the use of ACM rain screen cladding panels and associated thermal insulation products used as part of multi-layered built-up wall systems. Before we publish any such guidance, we are ensuring we have our facts straight. With that in mind, I would very much appreciate your thoughts on my understanding of the current regulations. Now, Mr. Ledsome, I've read a lot of that to you for reasons that I hope are obvious,
yes.
But did you see this correspondence at any time before the 14th of June 2017?
I don't recall, no.
Before that date, the Grenfell Tower fire, were you informed by Brian Martin or anybody else in the department of any of the matters to which Nick Jenkins refers in this email?
I don't recall so.
Were you told by Brian Martin or anybody else that he had been made aware in clear terms that many tall residential buildings are clad in ACM polyethylene products.
I don't recall so.
Were you aware of any discussions about this at any time before the Grenfell Tower fire?
None that I recall being involved in.
Now let's look at Brian Martin's response. This is page 4, please. And what I was showing you there was the email that Nick Jenkins had sent to the BRE in the January of 2016. It had come, she'd sent him to the department. As we can see, he'd written to Brian Martin, and here is his response. 16th of January 2016 at 17:09 to Nick Jenkins, copied to Stephen Howard and Sarah Colwell. Hi, he says, hi Nick, it is for the designer and the building control body to consider if requirement B4 has been met. ADB give guidance on this by saying that the external walls should not provide a medium for fire spread into all buildings. It then offers two approaches, a set of rules or a full-scale test. In the rules, we deliberately added the word filler to address things that form part of the cladding system that are not insulation but could provide a medium for fire spread. I think the core of an ACP panel could reasonably be considered to be a filler, so unless the core material meets the rules, then AD suggests a full-scale test. However, if the designer and building control body choose to do something else, then that's up to them. I'm on the road at the moment, so drafting this from memory. Brian. That's what it says on page 5. Now, did you see that at the time?
No.
Did you discuss this response with Brian Martin at the time?
Not that I recall, no.
When was the first time that you saw this response?
When you've just put it up on the screen.
Right. What do you think of it?
Could you scroll back to the previous page, please? Accepting the point, if this may have been prepared in a bit of a hurry, I think it, in shorthand, does discuss, obviously, the two approaches. I think the option 1 and option 2 approaches set out in approved document 12 in simple shorthand language, but I'm sure would have been understandable, I would imagine, to Mr. Jenkins, and then reaches the makes the important point that the word filler was deliberately added to, as I understand it, the 2006 version of ADB to address this sort of issue, and then says that the core of an ACP panel could reasonably be considered to be filler. So therefore, if the panel was not of limited combustibility, the other option would have been to have ensured that the whole wall system had met the BR 135 criteria. Perhaps
my question was a little bit too open. We can see here that there is no reference here to Nick Jenkins's concern about the presence or the likelihood of presence of a rash of ACM panels with a polyethylene cord throughout the United Kingdom built environment.
No, there is not.
No. Are you able to offer an explanation about why Mr. Martin chose not to address that question?
I can't.
Now, given the email we saw earlier, in response to your own email of the 4th of January 2016 in response to the address fire, you'd asked him whether there was anything to worry about for Part B, and his response was that the polyethylene core of the offending product would be considered, so should not be used over 18 metres. Here we're seeing that he says it could reasonably be considered. Now, that answer introduces an ambiguity, doesn't it? Well, let me try it differently. I'm on the basis that it does introduce an ambiguity, we may disagree with that premise, but are you able to explain why Mr. Martin expressed himself in this way?
No, other than, he may have drafted this in haste, but a substantial reason, no.
Right. Now, you told us that you weren't told by Mr. Martin about the apparent, at least according to Mr. Jenkins, the apparent historic and ongoing use of ACM products with a standard polyethylene core in this country. That is something, I think you accept, that you should have been alerted to by Mr. Martin, not least because of your own question to him on the 4th of
Well,
January.
I think if there was evidence that of the nature of Mr Jenkins' email, then I think that would have been an issue which I would have expected to have been drawn to my attention.
Now let's look at Mr Jenkins's next attempt. It's the same date, later that night, at the top of page 4. If we go to that, please. He says, "Hi Brian, many thanks for your prompt response. In the light of the fires that have taken hold of a number of buildings clad in ACM panels in recent years, I also think that the core of ACM panels should most definitely be considered as a filler. Some ACM cores meet the rules of ADB, however the ones commonly used in the UK at present don't. To the best of my knowledge, there have been no full-scale 841 Thor tests carried out to date of any wall constructions featuring any type of ACM panel. I'm aware that 2 manufacturers of ACM have plans to have such tests carried out. This, however, unfortunately means that no existing buildings in the UK over 18 metres tall that feature ACM panels currently meet the B4 requirements. There are many such buildings, and the numbers are growing. Whilst I appreciate it's for the designer and building control body to consider if requirement B4 has been met, I do think the current situation is of grave concern. Surely this justifies the requirement for a less ambiguous statement of the rules. With the above in mind, do you think it would be worth setting up a meeting with the relevant bodies and experts represented to review the current presentation of the rules?" Now, did you at any time before the fire at Grenfell receive the news that, quote, "no existing buildings in the UK over 18 metres tall that feature ACM panels currently meet the B4 requirements. There are many such buildings, and the numbers are growing"?
I don't recall. I don't recall so.
Right. Now, I mean, this was, I think you must accept a very large red alert situation with a life safety matter that needed urgent attention.
I would accept it was a serious matter, yes.
That needed urgent attention.
It needed urgent consideration, yes.
Are you absolutely sure that you knew nothing at all about it?
Well, I mean, I presume you would have drawn my attention to any emails which suggested that Mr Martin or anyone else had drawn it to my attention. I cannot recall it being discussed with me. I can't say that my recollection would be 100% accurate on that point, but I cannot recall it being discussed. And as I say, if there are emails, or it's obvious that I have been copied into emails, then clearly I would accept that. But as I say, my recollection is that I wasn't aware of the seriousness of some of these representations.
Yes. And I don't think there are any emails. And my question is, can you think of a reason why Mr Martin would have kept this red-hot information, even assuming it was new to him, to himself?
It would be wrong of me to try and speculate. It may have been that he felt, well, this is an issue we could address in terms of clarifying in the next iteration of ADB. It may be that he felt that the guidance in BCA Guidance Note 18 was helping getting the message out, but I accept that neither of those two things deal with the sort of the situation where panels may be on existing buildings. I fully accept.
I mean, what I'm really trying to get at is in your experience of working with Brian Martin, whether he had, as it were, form for keeping important matters to himself and not keeping you completely and fully briefed.
Well, I mean, in all of these situations, I would rely on the judgment of the technical policy leads in discussion with the head of the technical policy team, i.e. Mr Harrell at this point in time, Mr Bird before him, to keep me informed and draw my attention to significant policy issues. Now, I didn't set out any parameters about what I felt should be drawn to my attention or not. I would rely on the best experience and professional judgment of my experienced team to do that.
So far as you are aware, is this right, that the contents of this email run I've shown you so far did not percolate up to you and beyond you to your seniors in the division or to the ministers?
Well, I'm pretty sure that they didn't percolate beyond me. I would have known about that. I can't recall seeing these emails at the time, and I say I cannot recall that I would not want to put 100% credence on my memory of any discussions about this particular email chain or some of the others you've shown me.
Right. Now let's go to the foot of page 2, because we can see Brian Martin's response to the Jenkins evening email. The next morning at 9:49, 17th of February 2016, he says this: "Thanks, Nick," and I think we need then to go to page 3. "I'm not sure the text really is all that ambiguous, given that it must cover all forms construction. People often argue that it isn't clear when they're trying to justify doing something that is clearly wrong. I'm not entirely sure that even the ACM products that have flame retardant cores would meet the rules of thumb in the AD, so it'll be interesting to see if any of them get through an 8414 test. But that's just my opinion. We've recently commissioned a survey of Part B users with a view to feeding into the next revision. In the first instance, it might help if you put your views into that, please." And then there's an internet address. "There's a meeting of the CWCT group to talk about cladding and fire safety. It's run by Bath University. Maybe you could ask them if you can get involved. Brenda Apted, details below, is organising things." Now, were you aware in February 2016 that Brian Martin considered that the text in paragraph 12.7 to be in any way ambiguous?
Well, at this point in time, I obviously saw the response to my email about the Dubai fire, which I read. I didn't check, except that I didn't check, and perhaps I should have checked, but I read that as being that Mr Martin was pretty clear about the requirement of the regulation and what it meant and what the relevant approved document guidance was seeking to achieve and the intent of that guidance.
Had you received any feedback by this point, mid-February 2016, that there were people in the industry trying to justify doing something on the basis of a clearly wrong interpretation of the approved document B?
I don't believe so.
Looking at the outcome, given what we see here, do you accept as a fact that the suggestion of a meeting and the clarification of what Nick Jenkins regarded as an ambiguity at the very least was not acted upon by the department at all at any time before the fire at Grenfell Tower?
Well, I don't know about the meeting of the CWCT group that's referred to here, but clearly we did not, because as a matter of fact, I mean, the department did not issue any guidance or further guidance on Section 12 of ADB. I mean, that is a question of fact.
Yes. I mean, you can see from the response I've read to you that Brian Martin's reaction was, instead of grappling with this within the department, was to send Mr Jenkins off to the CWCT group to talk about cladding and fire safety. My question is, why didn't the department take charge of this problem at that stage?
Well, it's a bit difficult for me to answer that question because, as I say, I was not aware, I do not recall being aware of this particular exchange at the time. All I can assume is that the various pieces of work which we had in train, the various other pieces of guidance which have been published, such as the BCA Guidance Note 18, were addressing the problem. That's all I can assume.
That's an assumption, though. It's not knowledge.
Well, clearly, as I said, it's accepted as a matter of fact. We did not issue any other any guidance.
I mean, are you able to explain why the department didn't take this problem by the scruff of the neck, have a meeting with Nick Jenkins, work out what the real problem was and work out how widespread it was, and take the initiative and take matters forward, as opposed to leaving it to Mr Jenkins and industry bodies to talk about?
Well, I mean, with hindsight, I absolutely accept that it should have been gripped better, and that is a matter of deep regret. I think all I can assume is that it was expected that we could address issues of clarifying the guidance through the work I described in terms of the revisions to ADB. I'm accepting everything that we've discussed previously about the delays to the timetable, etc. That the BCA guidance note, which obviously should have, all building control bodies should have been aware of, was a way of ensuring that building control would know of the issues and be able to grip them when it's considering proposals for building work, plans of building work, etc. But I absolutely accept that although that would deal with the sort of the present situation, it would not have dealt with the past situation.
But the BCA guidance note isn't it a good excuse, is it, Mr. Ledsome? Because the BCA guidance note was guidance to some part of the industry about guidance. The guidance itself, which is the statutory guidance, comes from the department. So you can't. How is it possible to rely or outsource the clarification of the statutory guidance to subordinate guidance issued by one section of the industry?
Building control bodies ultimately are the enforcing bodies, and clearly they take cognizance of the approved documents guidance, but it's perfectly open and legitimate for building control bodies to provide further guidance to their members on issues, which is done through the Building Control Alliance guidance note, and the LABC will do that for public sector building control, and for example, the NHBC would do it for NHBC. So, as you say, supplementary guidance notes are not sort of an unknown or an illegitimate part of the system, the process. But clearly, it is very regrettable, and I accept that, and accept even if I didn't know at the time, then I need to ask myself why I didn't know at the time, and should I have known at the time, and why didn't I take it upon myself to have been more challenging on some of these matters. It was felt that these mechanisms were sufficient to ensure that the building control world, and through them developers, because building control will be refusing plans of building work or not signing off building work, to get the message out. Now, I entirely accept criticisms of that was inadequate, but I'm trying to explain as best I can some of the thought processes that were probably going through our minds at the time.
But it wasn't, was it, for building control bodies or their collective organisations in the building control industry to resolve a fundamental and inherent ambiguity, latent or even patent, on the face of the approved document itself? That was for government.
Well, yes, but I think that obviously there is a clearly... I accept the opinion that was being expressed by Mr Jenkins, reflecting his experience, and I clearly accept also the concerns raised in the CWCT, and clearly they were all very serious concerns. Mr Martin had a view, as he's expressed in this email and previous emails, which perhaps didn't necessarily share some of the views about the ambiguity expressed by the likes of Mr Jenkins.
Let's move on in time then to the next CWCT fire group meeting, 17th March 2016. Can we please start with your statement at page 54, paragraph 207. And you say this: while preparing this statement, I've seen the CWCT minutes, 17th March 2016, which raise an issue regarding limited combustibility and the interpretation of section 12 of ADB, particularly paragraph 12.7, but I do not recall being aware of this at the time. Just so that we're clear, what was it that you weren't aware of at the time?
Sorry, the CWCT minutes and therefore the discussion.
I see. So you weren't aware of the issue regarding limited combustibility and the interpretation of section 12?
No.
Right. Were you aware at the time that the meeting was taking place?
I very much doubt it.
So you weren't told anything about about the outcome. Is that right?
No, I don't recall being told anything about the outcome.
Right. Well, let's see how we go then. Maybe we can take this a little bit more quickly with the minute. CLG 3019440, page 2. I'll show you page 1. I'm so sorry. Page 1, because that shows you the date and the attendees. There's the date, 17th March 2016, in Farrington Street, and those present are there. You can see David Metcalf is there, and Brian Martin is there, as well as others who I don't need to identify. And if you go to page 2, you can see at a heading, Combustibility of Material, at the foot of your screen, it says this: Approved Document B, Clause 12.7 requires insulation and filler material in the external walls of tall buildings to be of limited combustibility. BCA Guidance Note 18 extends this requirement to all material in the wall. It was accepted that Clause 12.7 was poorly written and open to interpretation. The title of the clause is also misleading, Insulation Materials / Products, and this will be changed in the next revision of ADB. I think we can pause there. Now, you saw these minutes, as you say, in the course of preparing your witness statement. Was this section of the minutes, when you saw them, a surprise to you?
Well, at this stage, I was aware of the BCA Guidance Note 18, so I would have understood what's said in the first paragraph.
Right. Second paragraph. Was that a surprise to you?
Well, clearly, I can't say it was a surprise to me, insofar as obviously the issue about Section 12.7 had been well aired prior to, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, and therefore prior to preparing my witness statement, and indeed prior to my becoming aware of these minutes. So I can't say it was surprising in terms of the exact terms in which you've asked that question, I'm afraid.
Right. You see, you had asked Brian Martin very pointedly, I would say so, on the 4th of January 2016 after the address fire, whether there was anything in ADB to worry about, and he had come back and told you in terms that the core of an ACM panel would be considered filler, you see? And here you are seeing a note only a year or so after that, in which the participants at the meeting, including Brian Martin, as I've shown you, accept that 12.7 is poorly written, open to interpretation with a misleading clause. Now, putting those two together, were you not surprised when you first saw these minutes?
I did not put them together at the time when I first saw this. That's the first point I make. Looking back on it, yes, there is a contradiction, I accept, between what I'd understood and what I understood being told in January 2016 with what's said in this meeting.
Now let's look and see what Brian Martin says. Let's go to his statement, please. CLG 3019469, page 49, paragraph 138. And he says this: On 17th March 2016, I attended the second meeting of the CWCT technical group. At the meeting, a draft roadmap to summarise the measures needed to ensure a facade complies with the prescriptive rules of ADB was presented. I recall being satisfied that the roadmap adequately set out how compliance with the functional requirements could be achieved. Excuse me. The minutes go on to note that the 2015 BCA Guidance Note 18 had extended the limited combustibility requirement to all material in the wall of a tall building. This was not an objectionable clarification. Indeed, at the meeting, it was accepted, as is recorded, that paragraph 12.7 of ADB was open to interpretation. Acting on behalf of the department, I undertook to change this misleading clause in the next revision of ADB. The conclusions of that section of the discussion were that, and he goes on to say what they are, the cladding should not contribute to the spread of fire, and that the combustibility clause is intended to include all materials in the external wall. An exception may be made for small isolated components that would not contribute to fire spread, emphasis in the original. Now, before the fire at Grenfell on the 14th of June 2017, were you made aware at any time that Brian Martin considered that 12.7 of the approved document was poorly written or open to interpretation or misleading?
I don't recall so.
Were you made aware at any time before the Grenfell Tower fire that he had told anybody else in the department that he considered that to be the case?
I don't recall so.
Did he tell you or that others in the cladding industry had expressed the opinion that 12.7 was poorly written, open to interpretation and misleading?
I don't recall so.
He didn't mention any of this to you. Is that right?
I don't recall so.
Well, you would recall that, wouldn't you?
I probably would recall it.
I mean, if he told you, come back from the meeting and told you that I've accepted that 12.7, which was the one thing that stopped a Dubai cladding fire happening here, was open to interpretation, poorly written and misleading, you'd recall that, wouldn't you?
Well, I think I probably would recall it.
Can we take it that he never mentioned a word of this to you?
Well, I can't. Sorry, it seems blindingly obvious as a thing to recall or not at this point in time. I cannot be, absolutely accurate in terms of my memory, but I think it's reasonable for you to say and put to me that if something of this importance, I would recall. I don't recall being told, and I think probably if I had been told, then I probably would remember.
Now, he refers there to Technical Guidance Note 18, Issue 1, which is the second edition, published in the June of 2015. Can we look at your statement, please, page 54, paragraph 208? You say this: I'm also aware of the Building Control Alliance Guidance Note 18, which was published in June 2015, which set out a view, you say there, of the interpretation of the requirements of ADB in relation to external wall systems, including reference to paragraph 12.7. And then you go on to say the BCA is an umbrella organisation, etc. And if you turn the page, its guidance is intended to assist building inspectors in understanding compliance issues to ensure consistency of practice across both sectors. The department did not approve this document, and I do not recall it being discussed at the time, although I'm aware that Brian Martin was involved in the discussions with the BCA when it was being prepared. Now, can we go back to the previous page, please, page 54? I emphasise this when reading it to you in the second line, because you say, which set out a view of the interpretation. When you say that, did it set out the correct view?
Well, without, I'd need to see the exact terms of the Building Control Alliance guidance note to be able to give you a definitive answer on that. No doubt you will show me them. But from when I saw the guidance note, and I can't recall exactly when I first saw it, though it wouldn't have been in June 2015, I'm sure of that. I don't think I read anything in that which leapt off the page to me to being an incorrect interpretation of the relevant requirements in ADB.
Right. Does that tell us that the view, as you set it out there, of ADB contained in the Building Control Alliance Guidance Note 18 of June 2015, and I think in this respect not different from the 2014 version, was a view shared by you and Brian Martin at the very least? I
believe so, yes.
Right. Were there any discussions between you and Brian Martin about that Technical Guidance Note 18, and specifically the fact that it applies the requirements of materials of limited combustibility to all elements of the external wall build-up, including external facings?
I don't believe having a discussion, certainly not at the time that the BCA guidance note was prepared. Certainly did not discuss it at that point.
Were you aware that the guidance recommended as the main route to compliance for buildings over 18 metres, as I say, that all elements of the external wall system were to be of limited combustibility, and not, let me just finish, and not only the insulation and the core of the rain screen panel?
It would assist me if I was able to actually see the relevant text.
Yes, let's do that. It's BCA 702. I think we'll take you to the June 2015 version because that's what you're referring to in your statement. BCA 702, Issue 1, as you can see, June 2015, titled Use of Combustible Cladding Materials on Buildings Exceeding 18 metres in Height. And I was asking you about, if we go to page, there's a lot in this.
Yes.
I'm not going to read it all to you, of course, given the time. But if we go to page 2, please, option 1, as you can see there, I'll read that to you. The use of materials of limited combustibility for all elements of the cladding system, both above and below 18 metres. This includes the insulation, internal lining board, and the external facing material. Smaller gasket parts and similar low-risk items can be excluded from this requirement. The definition of an MOLC, MOLC, is stated in Table A7 of ADB2. So my question was, were you aware that the guidance recommended that all elements of the cladding system, both above and below 18 metres, including the external facing material, were to be of limited combustibility?
Well, I know that there is an exclusion, which is very, although obviously not using the exact same terms as the exclusion in paragraph 12.7 is referenced there. I would have interpreted this as meaning that all of the most significant elements of the cladding system, I think the word was used earlier on in the guidance note I noted, should be of limited combustibility, but that there would be some smaller parts, as in the second sentence, which were excluded, and that would have been the BCA's version, as it were, of the relevant exclusions in AD 12.7. So I don't necessarily see a contradiction between this and what is in AD 12.7, even though obviously it's expressed differently.
Did you ever have a discussion with Brian Martin about whether approved document B, section 12, and its requirement for materials of limited combustibility was limited to the core of a rain screen panel, or extended further and included the surface of a rain screen panel?
I certainly didn't have that discussion to my recollection.
So when it says that the external facing material must be a material of limited combustibility, what was the basis for your understanding that that was consistent with approved document B?
Well, I mean, in discussing this, obviously, I'm talking with the benefit of hindsight.
Well, let's not do that.
Right.
I'd like you to go back to the time, mid-2015, and your statement, and I want to know whether at the time you had any thoughts or any discussions about the breadth of option 1 and how it could be the case that external facing material was required to be material of limited combustibility.
I would not have had those discussions
Right.
in summer 2015.
Right. Did you ask yourself internally in your own mind the question, what is it that not only extends the MOLC requirement to the core of a panel, which was the discussion that you, I think, had an understanding that you had, but extends further than that to the skin, the external surface?
Well,
do you have any internal thought processes about that?
Well, not at the time.
No. And at any time before the Grenfell Tower fire?
I think that's unlikely. I don't recall having so. I think it's unlikely.
Did you understand the guidance produced by organisations such as the BCA to have the same status as the statutory guidance produced by government?
Well, clearly they do not, because they're not statutory guidance.
No. Did you consider that it was possible for industry guidance to extend, by which I mean expand, the meaning or scope of any provision in the guidance? Approved document B.
I'm pausing to this question, if I may, because, I mean, the short answer is, industry guidance clearly cannot sort of supersede government guidance. There is a but, however, which is thinking about how compliance with the requirements of the regulation may be met. So, for instance, it is perfectly legitimate, and if I may draw an analogy, an example from somewhere else, where, in effect, compliance with an industry standard is regarded as compliance with the regulation. So this is in relation to BS 7671, which refers to electrical safety, where we spend a bit of time saying this, but basically what we say in approved document P, which is Part P, electrical safety, is that if your work complies with BS 7671, it will comply with Part P. So the concept of drawing on industry guidance to support approved documents guidance is understood and is clearly part of the system. And that's why, for example, we would reference other standards and so on, and indeed industry guidance documents in all of the approved documents. So that is why I'm pausing, because if perchance that industry guidance went beyond the terms of the approved document, and that was what industry regarded as good practice, then I would think building control bodies may well point to the industry guidance as good practice, what good looks like, and work with the relevant duty holder on complying with that. And then ultimately, if the duty holder didn't like that but reverted back to the approved document guidance, then clearly there is the issue about how that works in terms of the statutory provisions relating to the status of approved documents in the Building Act. I'm sorry, that's a very roundabout and convoluted answer, but I'm not necessarily sure there is an absolute yes-no answer to that question. And I apologise, as I say, if that was rather a complex answer.
Did you discuss with Brian Martin at any time after mid-2014, when issue 0 of the BCA's Technical Guidance Note 18 was first promulgated, or August when it went onto the website that year, that the NHBC and indeed the BCA was taking a more restrictive line on combustible materials in the cladding of high-rise buildings than ADB contemplated?
I don't recall having any discussions with Mr. Martin or anyone else about that.
I think we can agree that no revision or amendment to the text of Section 12 of ADB was ever made to indicate this apparent extension.
Well, certainly not at this time, no.
No. Were you aware of any attempts by the Department to communicate this interpretation of paragraph 12.7 to a wider audience than the members of the BCA or CWCT fire group?
I don't think so, no.
Now, you say in paragraph 208 that the Department didn't approve Technical Guidance Note 18. Is that because the Department did not routinely approve industry guidance such as this?
No, because, as you will be aware, there's a sort of particular status to approval as set out in the Building Act, and we would have had to have gone through various procedures, etc. So, no, we would not approve formally industry guidance of this nature.
Could, for example, Brian Martin have told the meeting in March, the CWCT meeting on the 17th of March, that the BCA Technical Guidance Note 18 had expanded the guidance, or expanded the restriction, I should say, in paragraph 12.7?
Well, he could certainly have drawn the CWCT's attention to the BCA guidance note and expressed a view as to whether, expressed a view about that guidance in terms of how he saw it fitting with the system and what he saw it doing.
Now let's go to NHB 403453. This is a longish email chain in August 2014. So it's back in time. And if we go, please, to page 2, and the email sent by Steve Evans of NHBC to Brian Martin on the 15th of August. I think we touched on this earlier on in your evidence, but let's look at the third paragraph, which I did pick up with you. He says this: I've also attached for your information a copy of the BCA guidance note on the use of combustible cladding materials on residential buildings, which has been produced to reinforce the requirements of the regulations and to aid industry on how they can prove compliance when proposing to use materials on buildings over 18 metres that are not materials of limited combustibility. And a note was attached. And if we go up to the top of page 2, we can see Brian Martin writing as follows on the same day: thanks, Steve, that's very helpful. Is the BCA note published? And if we go to page 1, we can see Steve Evans replying an hour later and saying, "Hi, Brian, it's due to go onto the website shortly. We're presently changing providers. I understand, so there's a slight delay." And then his response to that in the next email up in the chain, same day, a couple of minutes later, 20 minutes later, "Okay, thanks. Whoever wrote it did a good job." Now, isn't that, in all practical terms at least, the department's approval of the document?
Well, it's not formal approval.
It's not formal approval.
No.
But it's an indication of approval.
It's an indication that that Brian felt that the particular document did a good job in terms of the subject matter and presumably the presentation and drafting of it, and therefore, if it was going to be published by the BCA, as it obviously was, then the department was not then immediately going to say, "No, we don't agree with this. Take it down."
Right. Were you aware? Let me go back a bit. Can we go to his statement, please, again? Brian Martin's statement at CLG 30194969, page 49, paragraph 138. And this is the final sentence. I've showed you this before. He says, "Acting on behalf of the department, I undertook to change this misleading clause in the next revision of ADB." He's referring there to 12.7. Were you aware at the time that Brian Martin had given that undertaking?
I was not aware at the time.
What authority did he have to do so on behalf of the department?
Well, I read this as saying that obviously there's a clear process when we're changing approved documents, as has been discussed, for those documents to go through due process, internal clearances, etc., etc. So, of course, ultimately, it's the authority rests ultimately with ministers to sign this off. I read this as simply saying, I note what you're telling me. I will make sure that when we produce the revised version of ADB 12, subject to agreement of ministers, etc., this change will be made. That is how I would read that. And I don't think anything more than that is intended, and certainly I would not read anything more into it than that.
Did Brian Martin tell you at any time before the Grenfell Tower fire that he had given this undertaking, as he says he did?
I don't recall so.
Do you remember him telling you at any time before the fire that paragraph 12.7 required amendment?
I don't recall so.
In March 2016, which is when we are at the moment, there was no ministerial agreement to a review of approved document B, was there?
Well, there was no ministerial agreement to the specific plan of work. No. Correct.
And indeed, the discussion document that we went through last week was still in the process of being drafted.
Correct.
And it hadn't been submitted to ministers.
Correct.
No. And in fact, the final discussion document didn't include any reference to the ambiguity or the requirement to change a misleading clause in 12.7, did it?
It did not.
Are you able to explain why that is so?
Well, I think that this would have been a matter, in my view, that we would have addressed through the simplification and clarification process, so it would have been absorbed within that process. And I think we discussed last week the distinction which I had in my mind about the work on ADB, which was to do with clarification and simplification, and I would have placed a change to clause 12.7 in that category, as opposed to the technical work where, as I explained last week, we were looking at some new issues which we didn't have answers to, and therefore we were treating them as issues that needed to be explored, etc., through research and so on. So I would have seen this very much as part of the simplification, clarification exercise, and would have been dealt with like that.
Let's move on to the July of 2016, CLG 1008347. Second email down in the chain on page 1 is an email sent by you on the 20th of July 2016 at 12:34 to your G6 and G7 staff in the building regulations team, I think. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Subject, slide pack for new ministers. Our new minister, you write, our new minister has asked for a slide pack on building regulations / EPCs, and then you go on to give some details about what's needed. Now, if we go to the top email in the chain, we can see a response, only to you, from Richard Harrell, 20th of July 2016. Bob, can you also include maintaining cost-effective technical standards in response to evolving industry practice, or something similar in the bullets? This is needed as a counterpoint to the deregulatory agenda, and important that ministers recognise that there are risks if they decide not to maintain the core standards, e.g. flammable tower cladding. Do you know, why was there a reference there, as you understood it at the time, to flammable tower cladding? What was that about?
Well, I don't know what it was about. I don't recall asking Mr Harrell at the time what he had particularly in mind as opposed to a general comment. I think the key thing I take reading this email is that a concern from Mr Harrell rightly as to whether there might be any pressure, which there wasn't, but just in case, to reduce standards. The key phrase, I think, is if they decide not to maintain the core standards, and then the reference to flammable tower cladding would be a reference to the maintenance of the core standard. I obviously can't comment for what was in Mr Harrell's mind, but that's how I think I would have interpreted what he said at the time.
Right. But you didn't ask him. You didn't know what he meant and you didn't ask him.
No, I was very clear in my own mind about the key point, which was about we need to be very careful, we need to be very clear with ministers about the risks associated if deregulation actually led to existing provisions being changed and weakened in any shape or form. And I think Mr Harrell would have mentioned this as an example. So if,
well, he does. Sorry.
Yes, he does. So
he does. My question, really, what I really want to get at is, we can see he uses this as an example, but you don't pick it up with him. Was the reason it was being used as an example because the department was well aware by this point of the importance of ADB addressing flammable tower cladding in light of what the department at the very minimum knew, including you, about the fires in Dubai?
Well, of course we knew ADB 12 was important. I think there's a distinction between, the issues around whether ADB 12 can be improved, and we've discussed that. I think what we are getting at here, and this was meant to be a sort of a one-liner in a detailed slide pack, which we discussed last week in my evidence, to make the point that there are some core standards which we as officials would advise are absolutely essential to ensuring safety of people using buildings, including B41, for example. And really, whatever you do about deregulation, then this is something that you shouldn't be looking at. I mean, I think that is the message that we were trying to get. Now, whether that came clearly across in the presentation, then I accept that's another issue, and perhaps we discussed it last week, and I think some of that presentation there was too much shorthanding maybe in the constraints of time and space I had in putting that together.
Now, I want to ask you one or two questions about something slightly different, Fire Sector Federation. Can we go to your statement, please, at page 56, paragraph 215? And at paragraph 215, you say, I was aware that the Fire Sector Federation, FSF, expressed views on ADB and had planned to set up a working group on ADB. I recall this came to my attention in October 2014, paragraph 5.4 of the minutes for the third BRAC meeting of October 2014. I recall that Brian Martin went to meetings of this group, but I did not attend, and I never saw any outputs from the SFF's work. I'm not aware that the department ever received any formal outputs from the SF's work. Now, that's your statement. Against that background, Mr Ledsome, can we go to CLG 30's19394? Now, this is an email sent to you and Richard Harrell by Brian Martin, CLG 30's19394. Brian Martin to you and Richard Harrell, 13th of June 2017, subject, Fire Sector Federation campaign for a review of ADB. Note the date.
Yes.
And note the time.
Indeed.
15:59.
Yes.
Do you remember receiving this?
Well, clearly I received it. Whether it registered with me at this precise time and this precise date, I can't recall, and clearly it contradicts what I said in my statement, and I apologise for that.
Now let's look at the brochure that's attached, which is referred to by Mr. Martin. It says, if we go to that on page
just
one.
a minute, Mr. Millett,
Yes.
we've lost.
My screen's gone blank.
Says mine. I've just realised it has gone away. In fact, it looks like it's become disconnected completely.
Well, somewhere something has gone which has cut off all our screens. So.
Yeah. I mean, you may would have intended to ask me, but just
Well,
perhaps-
can we, let's
Well,
don't say
it's
anything
coming
more
back,
until
don't
I can
worry.
get the document back. I think it's a. Let's just pause for a moment.
Okay.
So it may not be. No.
Take a few minutes over it.
Right, well, you take your time and see what you can do for us.
Mr. Chairman, my microphone's gone off, I think, as well.
Go
I
back.
don't know how long this will take, but it might be sensible to take the break now for the CP questions. I say that because I'm only going to ask about this document.
And this is your last topic.
This is my last topic and my last document.
Well, we could do that. Yes.
I mean, obviously, there may be further follow-up questions from the questions I asked, but it's unlikely
not
given
very-
the nature of the document.
Right. Yeah, well, I think we might do that. Mr. Ledsome, the accepted procedure is that when counsel gets to the end of his questions, we have a break for
Yes.
both to enable him to sweep up anything he's overlooked and also to allow other people to make suggestions. I think it might be sensible to take that break now.
Yes.
That will give the people in charge of the document display time to get that going, and we can use the time in that way. So we'll break now. 15 minutes should be long enough, shouldn't it, Mr. Millett?
I think it will be long enough, yes. We've had a long break since the 2 days
we
of
have.
last week.
Well, should we say 10 minutes?
No, let's say 15, just to be absolutely clear.
Right.
Thank you.
There you are, Mr. Ledsome. 15 minutes. We'll come back at 5 to 1, and then we'll see what further questions. There'll certainly be some on this document that you haven't yet
Of course.
shown, but we'll see what else there is for you then. All right?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to go to the usher, please. Right, Mr. Millett, well, we'll make use of the time in that way. We'll come back at 5 to 1 and see what things look like then.
Yes, thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Would you ask Mr Ledsome to come back in, please? Right, Mr Ledsome, well, our connection with the documents has, I'm glad to say, been restored, for which I thank our technical experts, and we'll now take the remainder of your questions. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. We're now back on. I was on, well, I've shown you your witness statement, and I was on CLG 30193994. And this is the email that Brian Martin sent you and Richard Harrell on the 13th of June 2017, just before 4 p.m. that afternoon. And he attached the brochure, as you can see, from the FSF. The brochure itself is at CLG 30193995. And the title of it is, Why Does Approved Document B Need to Be Reviewed? And it goes on, the last review of the approved document BADB was carried out in 2006. We've witnessed significant changes to building design and construction over the last 10 years. It is now out of date, placing businesses and communities all over the UK at potentially fatal risk. Now, you saw this at the time, yes?
Well, can I just explain that it was sent to me at the time, and obviously it arrived quite late in the day on the 13th of June. To be honest with you, I don't recall, I certainly didn't read it at that point as soon as it arrived in my inbox, which is why I made the statement in my witness statement erroneously. I realise that I hadn't seen anything from the FSF. I think probably what would have happened is that if I probably would have thought, long document here, I'm not going to be dealing with this tonight, I'll put it in the in tray for tomorrow, and of course, the world changed.
Mr. Chairman, we lost the document.
Yes, I didn't think I'd interrupt Mr Ledsome's answer, but...
Well, the answer is we have on record, but I'm afraid this is a problem. I don't know how long it'll take to come back. There are one or two passages in this document I need to show the witness. I'm going to suggest, Mr. Chairman, if it's not inconvenient to the witness and to you and your members of the panel, that we break now and come back at 5 to 2 and hope that the... Right, well...
It's just possible it might be coming back fairly quickly. Can I just ask technical support, who I know are making a valiant... Oh, well, you've answered my question. It's come
Right,
back.
there it is.
Thank you very much
I'm
indeed.
hoping we can get there before the next collapse, if there is one. I hope there isn't. But thank you for the last answer.
Just a minute. Ms Istvan hasn't got her screen working. Are you sure? Have you got it on your screen?
I have, yes, Chair.
Right, and you have, Mr Millett?
I have, yes.
Right. It looks so it's on the public screens as well. All right, would you mind going on? We'll go on for the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, just looking at the paragraph I've just read out to you, did you agree in June 2017 that the guidance in approved document B was out of date, potentially fatally so?
Well, it was out of date and needed review, yes, of course.
And indeed, it was to prove exactly so 9 hours later.
Well, indeed.
Yeah. Now, let's go to page 4. I want to ask you about some of the numbers there in the white text on a blue background.
Yes.
On page 4, blue text on a white background, I think is what I mean, under other findings.
Yes.
And it says there, I'm sorry, you've got two sets of figures, some of which are derived from the smaller print, but we're looking at the middle of the screen. Other findings from the FSF and CIC surveys include 92% of FSF members indicate a need to make changes to building regulations and approved document B. More than half of the CIC find the guidance in approved document B difficult to use. 100% of FSF members agreed the need to address inconsistencies in building definitions. Over 88% of FSF members and 42.3% of CIC members agree. And then document B is not adapted to suit the trends used in today's construction methods, design and usage. You see that?
Yes.
Now, you may or may not have read this in detail on or after the afternoon of the 13th of June 2017. Do you know when you first read it?
Gosh, it would have been some time way after the fire.
Right. And presumably, would this be right that your thoughts on reading this document in light of the events of later that night were that this was something of a prescient prediction?
Well, clearly, I mean, I don't think we have ever said that ADB was not needed to be reviewed for all sorts of reasons, and we've gone through this. So clearly, the FSF, views it's absolutely clear from this summary the depth of feeling amongst the members of the FSF and the CIC about issues with approved document B. So of course I accept what is reported here about those concerns, and I think we've talked a lot about the regrets that all of us have, I have, about the delays in that review process.
Well, let's take a look at the way in which Brian Martin brought this document to your attention on that afternoon. If we can get back to the email, please, at CLG30193994. And because I didn't read the text of it to you, it says this: both the Federation have been sitting on this until after the election. It's now on their website, and he gives the address. I expect our new minister will have this leaflet shoved up his nose at some point soon. Brian, what did you understand Brian Martin to mean by that last sentence?
Well, I think what he would have meant is that the Fire Sector Federation would have very quickly drawn the document to the attention of the new Building Regulations Minister or the Fire Safety Minister, or probably both.
Would you agree that the tone in which he stated what you have very politely just said was dismissive and casual to the point of cynical?
No, I would not.
You wouldn't?
I would not accept that. I mean, clearly, it was. I can understand why you would make that point to me. I would not have dealt with it, and certainly, if Brian had then said, if we hadn't been dealing with Grenfell, that we can just ignore this document, then I would have said, I don't think we can ignore this document, and I'd have wanted to understood it and explored it, and seen how what was being proposed in the document fitted or could be brought in to the work we had underway on ADB. So Mr. Martin will have to answer himself what he meant by this phrase. It's certainly not a phrase I would have used, and I certainly would not have accepted if it had come to pass that this was an approach taken towards what was an important piece of stakeholder communication, which we had been expecting for some time, I believe. I think I referred back to when I think I first heard about this initiative, going back a couple of years, if not longer, and clearly the FSF were an important body. I recall that Sir David Amis asked for us to be involved with the FSF in the APPG correspondence we discussed last week, and Minister Wharton or Minister Barwell agreed that would be the case. So, to my mind, this was absolutely an important contribution to what needed to be or could be changed in ADB, and I would have been absolutely insistent that it was treated in that respect.
Does the tone which Mr. Martin adopted in his last sentence there characteristic of his or your division's approach to fire safety concerns
No, I don't
raised
accept
by
that.
external stakeholders?
No, I don't accept
You
that.
don't. Mr. Chairman, there are one or two extra questions that have come in from others to ask, and one or two of my own. They're not necessarily 5-minute questions. It might be sensible to take a break now.
Well,
and
how long do you think you need?
maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, somewhere between
I think
5
it'd be
and
better
10.
to get them out of the way now.
Very well. Now, Mr. Harrell gave evidence on day 245 that he wrote a naive email in May 2016 asking Mr. Martin if there were technical changes to ADB following the Lacknell recommendations. And he said that there were tensions with Mr. Martin and that he was dissatisfied to the point where he was looking for alternative employment and didn't want to upset Mr. Martin. Day 243, apologies. I don't think I need to give you the reference. Were you aware of any tensions between Mr. Harrell and Mr. Martin?
Well, I was certainly aware. Could you provide me with a date, please, for that?
May 2016.
May 2016, sure. So I was aware that both Mr. Harrell and Mr. Martin were very frustrated with lack of progress. And I know Mr. Martin, being Mr. Martin, he would not have been slow in making that known to Mr. Harrell and indeed to me. And he probably would have put it in quite forthright terms without knowing the exact details of the exchanges to which you refer. So clearly, I mean, I remember discussing this with Mr. Harrell, and yes, we wanted to see what we could do to try and ensure that Mr. Martin remained a member of the team, remained motivated to do the job we wanted of him. And that would have been behind, I think, some of what Mr. Harrell was talking about there. I think I also recall, and I'm sorry, I did see some of this evidence, so I'm slightly sort of playing back the way Mr. Harrell described it, him referring at the time that he had a different view, for example, on how approved documents in general, but also including ADB, should be restructured, which perhaps didn't fit with the way Mr. Martin thought such a restructuring could happen. But I regarded that as absolutely two professionals, with a difference of view, which they're quite right to express to one another, and they should sort it out, which I believe is what happened.
Given that Mr. Harrell didn't want to upset Mr. Martin, as he put it, was there a concern or a sense that you had that Mr. Martin was somehow impregnable, given his apparent expertise?
Well, no one is impregnable, but on the other hand, if Mr. Martin had felt so dissatisfied that he handed in his resignation, he would have been a significant loss in terms of expertise and experience and knowledge to the team. And at this point in time, we had been badly scarred by our challenges and difficulties and failures, frankly, which Mr. Harrell talked about, and I'm happy to give my own view on this, in terms of recruitment of new professionals, for reasons which Mr. Harrell explained to you, and I absolutely concur with Mr. Harrell about all of that. So my first instinct, and I'm sure I probably would have said this to Mr. Harrell, would be we should try our utmost to ensure to keep Mr. Martin. That doesn't mean to say we will do everything he wants and everything he says. But on the other hand, if there are choices about things that we can do, which might make the difference between Mr. Martin staying with us and Mr. Martin upping and going, then I would opt for the first.
Mr. Harrell told us yesterday that, I use his words, psychologically we were just beaten up, frankly. I think we were just not confident, we were stretched, and over time that must impact on your psychology. That's what he told us.
Yes, I heard that.
Yesterday. Were you aware at the time that he was feeling that way? Beaten up, as he put it?
Well, I mean, Mr Harrell was under a lot of stress, for all sorts of reasons. And so I was aware of that, and we did try and help Mr Harrell with that. For example, in terms of time off, etc., to recuperate and recharge his batteries. It was a very difficult time for Mr Harrell, and I know that he had some excellent ideas about how the programme of work could be carried forward. And really what he wanted to do, and he was absolutely right in this, was to try and find a way that in the department and with ministers, the team had a programme of work which was set in effect. We're talking just immediately post or in the year after the 2015 election. So a programme of work, appropriately resourced, appropriately staffed, with an appropriately agreed research programme, as well as for examples, that would take us through that period. So we weren't in this constant chopping and changing and having every 5 minutes to deal with the next issue. That would have given stability to him, to the team. It would have probably meant that we produced better products. It probably would have meant that we would have produced products with greater dispatch. And he took the failure to achieve that, as you would have obviously seen from his evidence, very, very deeply. And I regard, one of the things I would have said in my final remarks, so I'll say it now, is I bitterly regret, it was my job, part of my role, that when, to ensure that the building regulations were not always at the back of the queue for resources, for priorities, etc. And that's part of what a deputy director's role is, to make sure that he or she is representing his or her team to the top of the office to understand, to get, appropriate attention. And it is a bitterly regrettable for me, because obviously, who knows whether it ultimately impacted on this precisely what happened in Grenfell. That the inquiry will reach a view and decide that. But it will be forever on my conscience that I failed on that, because we were at the back of the queue and we didn't get up the front we didn't get building regs up the queue. And that was my role, and I can't say that I discharged that to the best as I would have wanted to.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ledsome. I think you probably anticipated my final question to you, but
yes.
I feel I ought to ask it anyway, if only to flag it. And if you feel you need to repeat what you've just told us, then please do that. But looking back on it now and looking at the evidence that we've covered over the last 2.5 days together, and perhaps reflecting on it over the weekend and the time you've had between, is there anything now, looking back, that you would have done differently?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to run away from the fact that Grenfell happened on my watch. I was the head of the Building Regulations Division. There are responsibilities that go with that role. I've explained and accepted as we've gone along where there were misjudgments and errors, and I accept that the inquiry may conclude that they were avoidable errors and serious misjudgments, and I am not going to run away from my share of the responsibility for that. That's my role. That's what I would regard my role as the leader of the team encompassing. I feel that we tried our best, that I tried my best within various limits, but I have to ask myself the question, I have asked myself the question very, very deeply, was my best good enough? And it will be forever on my conscience that perhaps my best was not good enough, and I regret that. Looking at it slightly more dispassionately, clearly looking back on it, in terms of the review, the big decision point was sort of spring 2016. I think if we had at that point taken a hard-nosed view that actually, however optimistic we may be, we are not going to get all of the programme of work associated with the discussion document, the simplification work, the technical reviews done within those timeframes. I think we could and should have thought seriously about extracting the Part B work, even if it was only the simplification of Part B, and driven on with that and got that going, and that obviously would have helped, not least with Mr. Martin and Mr. Harrell's motivation. Now, why was that the case? Now, I think Mr. Harrell mentioned weaknesses in our programme management, and I think there was something in that. We were working very much through our line management chain, and realistically, we didn't have someone outside and not personally attached to what we were trying to do. And I said, I think in some of my evidence that, I think I lost sight of the trees for the wood on the discussion document, and I think that's absolutely right. We didn't have someone who said, are you really sure you're going to be able to deliver to this timetable? Are you really sure you're going to be able to deliver? What's your plan B? What do you need to be putting in place for your contingency? That was a programme management failure, and we should have seen that, and I should have seen that and done something about that. I'm sorry, I'm going to take a bit of time here, Chair. I hope you don't mind. I have got some things which I really do want to say, and so it will take me another 5 minutes or so. I think the other issue on challenge is that, as I've pretty much, well, I did accept, not pretty much, in some of my comments this morning, we did put our faith that the system was working as it was intended to do, as originally set up under the Building Act, that building control bodies were doing a competent job, that industry bodies were doing a competent and appropriate job, and that duty holders were properly and seriously addressing compliance, or what they needed to do to ensure compliance. And I mean, not just Grenfell, but everything that's happened subsequently clearly shows that was a misplaced optimism. And whether we thought the alternative was just too horrendous to contemplate, I don't know. Maybe part of that was subliminally at the back of our minds, my mind. Now, I would defend some of what we tried to do through the discussion document on the system issues. Now, I'm not going to pretend or come halfway to pretending that our analysis and our prognosis anyway compares to what Dame Judith Hackett came forward to in her review in terms of its precision, insight, or power. But we realised that the system, there were challenges to the system, and within the limits, particularly the limits placed on us by, in effect, the ruling out of changes to the Building Act, meant that we were limited in what we could do. But we were looking at resourcing, we were looking at quality issues in building control. So we did try, but it was weak, though I think we did the best that we could within our terms. But again, coming back, and I think this is the real, there's the lesson of challenge, both on an institutional basis, that we didn't at the time have that person who wasn't attached to what we were trying to do, had no sort of, I hate the word, but I hate the expression, but I can't find a better one, skin in the game, you know what I mean, who could say, are you really sure about this? Are you really sure about this? Now, I'm very pleased that subsequently the department has appointed a chief scientific advisor. A chief scientific advisor was in post for a short period of my time on a part-time basis, but there wasn't a chief scientific advisor around for a significant period of time. Now, he or she could have been the person to provide that challenge, and also he or she could have brought us in perhaps a wider network of contacts who could provide us with a slightly different view from that we received from the contacts we had. So that's an institutional challenge issue, and I think from a personal perspective, the lesson I have learned from this whole process is, I should have perhaps challenged more strongly, including my team, and including the top of the office, and including what I was hearing from others. I would just like to reiterate the resources point, and I've said I feel that I didn't do as good a job as I could have done in that, but we were under intense pressure. I'm not saying that the building regulations team suffered disproportionately worse than other parts of the department. I don't think we did if you just purely look at the numbers and reductions. But I think the real problem that we had is our vulnerability on the technical side to, as it were, natural wastage. So people would resign, people would retire, absolutely right. But as Mr Harrell described, and I remember the difficulties and the challenges and the grief that we had trying to recruit replacements was a real, you'll have seen from the evidence how difficult that would have been. I'd actually forgotten that we'd got so far as to get someone who would have done a really good job, possibly working with Mr Martin, so far as an appointment had been made, but he quite rightly just got fed up with the length of time it took to get through, as much as anything, the security clearance. It was just a function of the fact that we moved into the same premises as the Home Office. And that's been an ongoing issue which has affected many people. So, yeah. I should also say, I think I accepted this. I also feel personally that I should have had a better grip on the handling of the APPG correspondence, because clearly we didn't handle that as well as we could. And I think there were some learning points also about how that correspondence is handled. It was probably just, in effect, treated as a normal piece of correspondence, and it shouldn't have been. And there were faults there. But as I say, frankly, I will not accept impugning of motivation of my team on some of this. I can understand why that view would have been taken, but maybe reached on the basis of reading emails cold. My team were dedicated professionals, and they were dedicated to the task. But on the other hand, as I said, however you try, sometimes your best is not good enough. I deeply regret that is the case, and I wish to apologise to the victims, bereaved survivors, in relation to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, Mr Ledsome, it only remains for me to thank you very much for coming here and assisting us with our investigations and for giving your evidence. I'm sorry we've detained you for longer than we had originally anticipated, but we're grateful to you nonetheless, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I should thank you also on behalf of the panel, all three members of the panel, Mr Ledsome. It's been very helpful to us to hear how things were going on inside the department, shed a lot of light on the documents we've been seeing, and so we shall find it very helpful. So thank you very much for giving us so much of your time.
Thank you. I'm glad to have been of assistance.
And now, of course, you're free to go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, this is 2:15. Happy to say 2:15. Right, thank you very much, Mr Millett. We have another witness waiting to appear.
We do. And that next witness is Sir Ken Knight, and he will be taken by Andrew Kinnear, Queen's Counsel.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think, although it's never popular to have a slightly shorter than usual lunch hour, I think on this occasion we'll truncate it a little bit and we'll resume at 2:15, please.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.